The sky turned the color of old bruises. Marcus Hayes sat in the center of his round cabin 47 hours after the tornado had passed, surrounded by 23 people who should have been dead. The curved wooden walls held them like cupped hands, every beam still standing, every joint still tight. Outside, where 46 houses once stood in neat rows along the valley floor, there was nothing, just torn earth and scattered debris, as if God himself had dragged an eraser across the landscape. Clay Brennan held a tin cup of coffee with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. He was 58 years old, had lived in Bitterroot Valley his entire life, and had never apologized to anyone for anything. Now he sat 3 feet from Marcus, his face gray as winter ash, and asked the question he'd been holding in his throat for 2 days. "How did you know?" Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, not yet. Across the room, his dog Atlas lay on a wool blanket near the curved door, his German Shepherd body still and silent, except for the slow rise and fall of his ribs. The dog's muzzle bore fresh scratches from digging through rubble. His right hind leg, already damaged from an old war injury, was splinted and wrapped. Atlas had saved 5 people in the hours after the storm, dragging them from beneath collapsed walls and overturned vehicles, working until his body simply quit. Now he slept the deep sleep of the utterly spent, and Marcus couldn't stop watching him, couldn't stop counting each breath. Clay asked again, softer this time, "How did you know it was coming?" The other survivors turned to look. An elderly woman named Beth, whose hip Marcus had pulled from beneath a fallen beam. A teenage boy who'd been trapped in an overturned truck until Atlas found him. Emma, Clay's 8-year-old granddaughter, who sat pressed against the dog's warm side, one small hand resting on his fur. They all waited for an answer. These people who'd mocked him 4 months ago, who'd laughed at his strange round house, who'd called him broken and crazy and dangerous. Marcus stood and walked to the curved window. Through the glass, he could see the devastation spreading across the valley. The tornado had carved a path 2 miles wide, and nothing square had survived. Nothing with corners to catch the wind. Nothing built the way people had always built, because that was how their fathers built, and their grandfathers before them. 4 months earlier, he thought. 4 months ago, he'd driven into this valley in a beat-up Chevy with everything he owned packed in the truck bed, and Atlas riding shotgun like he was surveying conquered territory. 4 months ago, Montana had seemed like salvation, a place where the mountains were old and steady, and the sky didn't turn green with rage. A place where he could build something that would stand, something that would last, something that would prove he wasn't the man who let 7 soldiers die because he didn't know how to say no to a superior officer who was wrong. But to explain that to Clay, to explain how he knew, Marcus would have to go back further. He'd have to go back 5 years to Afghanistan, to a forward operating base called Hammer, to a day when the sky turned the same sick color it had turned 2 days ago over Montana. He'd have to confess things he'd never said out loud, not even to the Army psychiatrist who'd signed his discharge papers with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and a prescription for pills Marcus never took. The wind that day in Kandahar province had started as a whisper. Marcus remembered that. He'd been a 30-year-old staff sergeant then, younger but already tired in the way that combat makes men tired, where the exhaustion lives in the bones and doesn't leave even after 12 hours of sleep. His unit, a 12-man engineering squad, had been tasked with constructing a forward outpost, a place where infantry could stage operations into hostile territory. They'd been working on the project for 6 weeks. The structure was nearly complete, a series of prefabricated modules arranged in neat squares, surrounded by blast walls and sandbags, everything by the book, everything according to specifications laid out by people who'd never been to Afghanistan and never would be. Atlas had been 2 years old then, a canine detection dog assigned to Marcus's squad after their regular handler was injured. The dog was good at his job, obsessive even, trained to find improvised explosive devices hidden in the dirt. He'd saved them twice in the first month, alerting to buried bombs before anyone stepped close enough to die. But on that particular morning, 6 hours before the storm, Atlas had started acting strange. He'd refused to enter the half-built barracks. He'd stood at the perimeter of the construction site, hackles raised, staring not at the ground where bombs might hide, but at the horizon, at the sky. Marcus had noticed. He'd spent enough time with the dog to recognize when something was wrong. He'd checked the animal for injury, for dehydration, for any physical explanation for the behavior. Nothing. Atlas was healthy. He was just afraid, in a way Marcus had never seen from a military working dog. The animal kept whining, a high anxious sound, and digging at the dirt as if trying to burrow down into the earth itself. Then the barometric pressure had started dropping. Marcus had checked the weather station. 20 millibars in 3 hours. The sky had begun to change, turning from pale blue to yellow, then to a shade of greenish copper that made Marcus's stomach clench with remembered fear, though he didn't know why. Not yet. The temperature had risen 15 degrees in an hour, an impossible spike for late afternoon in the desert. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the air thick and dead and hard to breathe. Marcus had gone to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Drummond, a 35-year-old West Point graduate who believed in data and regulations and chains of command. He'd reported what he'd seen, the pressure drop, the color change, the way Atlas was behaving. He'd requested permission to move the unit into the concrete bunker on the far side of the compound, the only structure with a curved roof, originally built as ammunition storage. Drummond had pulled up the official weather forecast. No storms predicted. The lieutenant had looked at Marcus with something close to pity and said no. The barracks needed to be finished by week's end. The mission timeline didn't allow for delays based on one soldier's intuition and one dog's nerves. They would continue working. Marcus had pushed back. Not hard enough. He'd said, "Sir, I really think we need to take this seriously." He'd said, "Atlas has never been wrong before." He'd even said, "I've got a bad feeling about this," which was about as close as a soldier could come to insubordination without crossing the line. But when Drummond had given him a direct order to return to work, Marcus had saluted and obeyed because that was what 30 years of life had taught him to do. You followed orders. You trusted the system. You assumed that people in authority knew better than you did. 6 hours later, the storm had hit. Not the gradual buildup that weather was supposed to have, but a sudden screaming wall of wind and sand that came over the ridge like a living thing. A haboob, they called it later. A massive dust storm that meteorologists said occurred maybe once every 50 years, with winds exceeding 200 miles per hour, carrying enough sand to strip paint from metal and flesh from bone. The square barracks had collapsed in 90 seconds. Marcus had watched it happen from 30 feet away, where he'd been securing equipment. He'd seen the walls bow inward, seen the roof lift and twist, seen the entire structure fold like cardboard under the impossible pressure of the wind. 12 men had been inside. 7 had died, crushed under falling beams, or suffocated by sand, or simply lost in the chaos of disintegration. Lieutenant Drummond had been one of them. So had Sergeant Carter, Marcus's best friend, the man who'd taught him how to play poker and how to cook eggs on a tank engine and how to laugh even when everything was terrible. Marcus had survived because Atlas had saved him. The dog had gone berserk at the first sound of the wind, had grabbed Marcus's sleeve with his teeth and dragged him toward the concrete bunker. Marcus had followed on instinct, stumbling through blinding sand, and the dog had pulled him inside the curved structure. 4 other men had made it in as well. They'd huddled there for 3 hours while the storm screamed overhead, and when it finally passed, they'd emerged to find the barracks reduced to splinters and 5 bodies buried in the wreckage. They'd found Carter last, his hand reaching up through the sand as if grasping for help that came too late. Marcus had dug with his bare hands for 4 hours, long after it was clear there was no one left alive to save. His fingers had bled, his lungs had filled with dust. He'd screamed Carter's name into the wind until his voice broke and nothing came out but air. The investigation afterward had been thorough and professional and utterly useless. No fault assigned. The storm couldn't have been predicted, they said. The official weather systems had shown no warning signs. The barracks had been built to regulation specifications. These things happen in war zones. Tragedy, but unavoidable. Lieutenant Drummond was posthumously commended for his service. The families of the dead were notified. The mission continued. But Marcus knew the truth. Atlas had warned them. The dog had known 6 hours in advance that death was coming. Marcus had reported it to a man who trusted data over instinct. And when that man had said no, Marcus had obeyed. He'd chosen hierarchy over knowledge, regulation over wisdom, because he'd been trained since childhood to believe that following orders was the same as doing right. 7 men were dead because Marcus hadn't been strong enough to refuse. The army had given him an honorable discharge, a Purple Heart for injuries sustained in the storm, and a diagnosis that meant he'd spend the rest of his life explaining to people why loud noises made him flinch and why he couldn't sleep without checking every exit in a room. They'd offered him counseling and medication and a disability check that arrived on the first of every month like clockwork, money that felt like payment for failure. Marcus had taken Atlas and left. The dog had been injured in the bunker, his right hind leg crushed when debris hit the entrance. The veterinarians had wanted to amputate, but Marcus had refused, had paid out of pocket for surgery and rehab, had spent 6 months working with the animal to rebuild strength. The leg never healed right. Atlas walked with a permanent limp, but he walked, and that was what mattered, because if the dog could carry his damage and keep moving forward, then maybe Marcus could too. They had driven west from North Carolina, from the base where Marcus had spent his final months out processing from the military. He'd had no destination in mind, just a need to move, to put distance between himself and the memories. He'd ended up in Montana because of a magazine article he'd read in a rest stop diner in Wyoming. The article had listed Bitterroot Valley as one of the safest places in America from natural disasters. Low earthquake risk, no hurricane threat, and crucially, the lowest incidence of tornadoes in the continental United States. Montana got an average of 10 tornadoes per year, the article said, and almost none of them in the western mountains. That statistic had sealed it. Marcus had driven north, purchased 15 acres of raw land on the valley slope for almost nothing, and started planning a house. Not to survive tornadoes, he told himself. There wouldn't be tornadoes. He was building this house to prove to himself that he could build something that would stand forever, something that nothing could tear down, because if he could do that, maybe he could also build a version of himself that wasn't haunted by the sight of Carter's hand reaching up through the sand. The design had come from memory. During his time in Kandahar, Marcus had worked briefly with an Afghan engineer, a man named Rashid, who'd studied architecture in Pakistan before the wars. Rashid had shown Marcus sketches of traditional circular homes, structures that had survived centuries in one of the harshest climates on Earth. The curved walls dispersed wind, Rashid had explained. Square corners caught pressure and created weak points. A circle had no beginning and no end, no place for force to grab and pull. It was the perfect defense against nature's violence. Marcus had saved those sketches. After the storm, after they'd buried Carter and the others, Marcus had gone back to Rashid to learn more. But Rashid was gone, killed 2 weeks after the storm by a roadside bomb. So Marcus had taught himself researching geodesic principles and fluid dynamics, studying how hurricanes moved and how wind behaved. He'd learned that the engineer had been right. Round structures were stronger. The science proved it. But when Marcus had arrived in Bitterroot Valley and started building his circular cabin, he hadn't told anyone about the science. He just quietly purchased materials, hauled them to his property, and started work. He'd bent wood with steam and patience, had calculated curves by hand, had poured a foundation in a perfect circle that the local building inspector couldn't find a regulation to approve or deny. It existed in a legal gray area, which was fine with Marcus. He wasn't asking permission. He was proving a point to himself, to Atlas, and to the ghost that followed them both. The construction had taken 4 months. Marcus worked alone most days, with Atlas lying in the shade nearby, watching. The dog never ventured far from Marcus's side anymore. The injury had slowed him, but it was more than physical limitation. Atlas had changed after the haboob, had developed the same watchfulness that Marcus carried, the sense that danger could arrive without warning, and survival depended on constant vigilance. They were both damaged, they were both hyper-aware, and they were both trying to build something that felt safe in a world that had proven itself catastrophically unsafe. People noticed, of course, you couldn't build a round cabin in the middle of Montana without attracting attention. At first, folks were just curious. They'd slow their trucks as they passed Marcus's property, crane their necks to get a better look. Some stopped to ask questions. What are you building? Why is it round? Marcus had learned to give short answers. A house, because I want to. Most people would nod, file him under eccentric, and move on. But Clay Brennan had been different. Clay owned the largest ranch in the valley, 300 acres of prime grazing land that his grandfather had homesteaded in the 1940s. He was a man who believed in tradition, in doing things the way they had always been done, because if something had worked for 3 generations, it would work for a fourth. When he saw Marcus's round cabin taking shape on the hill above his property, he saw a threat to that order. The first confrontation happened on a September afternoon when Marcus was hoisting a curved beam into place. Clay had driven his truck right up to the construction site, climbed out with his hands on his hips, and stared at the structure with undisguised disgust. What in the hell is that supposed to be? Marcus had set down his tools. A house. That's not a house. That's a damn circus tent without the canvas. Clay had walked around the perimeter, shaking his head. You got permits for this? Don't need permits for residential construction on my own land if it's under a certain square footage. Round footage, you mean? Clay had stopped walking and fixed Marcus with a hard stare. Look, I don't know what kind of weird ideas you brought with you from wherever you came from, but here in Bitterroot we build normal houses. Square houses. Houses that don't make the whole valley look like a carnival moved in. Marcus had felt Atlas tense beside him, the dog reading the hostility in Clay's voice. I'm not building on your land. What I do on mine is my business. It becomes my business when your freak show affects my property values. Clay had pointed at the half-finished structure. When folks drive through here looking to buy land, they're going to see that thing and think the whole area is full of lunatics. That affects what I can sell for when I'm ready to retire. Then don't retire. Clay's face had reddened. You think you're clever? You think you can come into our valley and just do whatever you want without regard for the community? That's exactly what I think, Marcus had said quietly. Because I bought this land fair and square, and last I checked, America didn't have laws about what shape your house has to be. Clay had started to respond, but Atlas had growled. It was a low sound, barely audible, but enough to make Clay take a step back. Control your animal, Clay had said. He's controlled. He just doesn't like when people threaten me. I'm not threatening you, I'm informing you. There's going to be a community meeting next week. I'm bringing this up. We're going to discuss what can be done about unpermitted construction that violates the character of the valley. Marcus had felt exhaustion settle over him like a blanket. You do what you need to do, but this house is getting built, whether you like it or not. Clay had left without another word, kicking up dust as he drove away. Marcus had watched him go, then looked down at Atlas, who was still staring in the direction Clay had gone. We're not making friends here, buddy. The dog had looked up at him with those steady brown eyes, and Marcus had understood. They didn't need friends. They needed safety. They needed a structure that would hold against anything the world threw at them. And if that meant being the valley's eccentric hermit, so be it. He'd been called worse things than crazy. The community meeting had happened the following Tuesday in the Bitterroot Valley Community Center, a prefabricated building that doubled as a polling place during elections and a bingo hall on Friday nights. Marcus hadn't planned to attend. He'd figured Clay would say his piece, people would grumble about the weird round house, and life would go on. But Clay had called him the night before and told him he'd better show up if he wanted any chance of defending himself. Defending myself from what? Marcus had asked. From being run out of the valley, Clay had replied. People are talking about taking legal action. Zoning violations, nuisance complaints, whatever it takes to make you tear that thing down and build something normal. So Marcus had gone, with Atlas on a leash beside him. The community center had been packed, at least 70 people crammed onto folding chairs. When Marcus walked in with his dog, conversation stopped. Eyes tracked him as he moved to an empty seat in the back. He'd felt like a specimen, something brought in for examination and judgment. Clay had stood at the front and presented his case. The round cabin was an eyesore. It violated the traditional character of the valley. It was potentially unsafe, built without proper permits or inspections. It set a bad precedent for future construction. If they allowed one person to build whatever strange structure they wanted, soon the whole valley would be chaos. Other people had chimed in. A woman who ran the local real estate office said she'd already had prospective buyers express concern about the area. A man who owned a guest ranch said his clients came to Montana for authentic Western experience, not to see experimental architecture. A young couple worried about what it said about the community's standards that they'd allow such a building. Through it all, Marcus had sat quietly, one hand resting on Atlas's head. The dog was tense, ears forward, tracking every speaker. When the floor finally opened for discussion, Clay had turned and gestured to Marcus. Mr. Hayes, you want to explain to everyone why you think it's acceptable to build that structure? Marcus had stood slowly. Every eye in the room focused on him. He'd spent years learning how to give briefings to military personnel. But this was different. These people weren't his subordinates or his peers. They were strangers who'd already decided he was a problem. I'm a veteran, Marcus had said. I served in Afghanistan as an engineering sergeant. I was there when a storm destroyed a conventional barracks and killed 7 of my men. The only structure that survived was a curved building. I studied the physics afterward. Round structures disperse wind force better than square ones. They're stronger, safer, and more stable. I built my cabin that way because I know it works. The room had been quiet for a moment. Then someone in the middle row had called out, "So you're building it because of PTSD? Because you're scared?" "I'm building it because I'm informed," Marcus had replied. "There's a difference." "But Montana doesn't get the kind of storms that Afghanistan gets," another voice had said. "We don't need special buildings. Our houses have stood for generations." "Until they don't," Marcus had said quietly. "Until the one storm that doesn't follow the pattern. Until the disaster everyone said was impossible. That's how people die, assuming safety instead of preparing for reality." Clay had shaken his head. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. The man's paranoid. He's seeing threats that don't exist and building based on fear instead of common sense. We can't let that dictate how our community develops." The vote had been overwhelmingly against Marcus. 52 people agreed that the round cabin should be subject to code enforcement review. Only 8 thought Marcus should be left alone. The meeting had ended with Clay promising to contact the county about inspection requirements for unusual structures. Marcus had walked out into the September night, feeling the weight of isolation settle over him again. He thought Montana might be different. He thought maybe, in a place this rural and independent, people would respect a man's right to build however he wanted on his own land. But he'd been wrong. People didn't like different. They didn't like being reminded that their assumptions might be faulty. And they especially didn't like veterans who came home broken and built strange houses as monuments to their damage. Atlas had pressed against his leg as they walked to the truck, and Marcus had looked down at his only friend in the world. "Just you and me, buddy. That's all we need." The dog had looked up at him, and Marcus swore he could read understanding in those eyes. They'd survived worse than community disapproval. They'd survived wars and storms and loss. They could survive this too. The cabin had been completed 3 weeks later, 24 feet in diameter, curved walls of steam, bent pine, a conical roof that shed water and snow with perfect efficiency, and a door that sealed like a submarine hatch. Marcus had designed every detail for maximum survivability, not because he expected disaster, but because building for worst-case scenarios was the only way he knew how to build anymore. The first night he and Atlas spent in the finished cabin, Marcus had lain on his sleeping bag looking up at the curved ceiling and felt something close to peace. The structure enclosed them without pressing in, held them without restraining them. The acoustics were strange. Sound moved differently in a circle, softer somehow, less harsh. Atlas had settled near the door in what would become his permanent station, and Marcus had thought maybe, just maybe, they'd found a place where they could start to heal. But 3 weeks after that, on a December morning when the temperature rose 20 degrees in 2 hours and the barometer dropped like a stone and the sky turned the color of infected flesh, Atlas had started digging at the frozen ground and Marcus had known. It was happening again. The impossible storm, the disaster everyone said couldn't occur, and this time he had to make people listen. This time he couldn't let the count rise from 7 to 7, plus however many lived in Bitterroot Valley. Now standing in his cabin with 23 survivors, with Clay Brennan asking how he knew the tornado was coming, Marcus understood that he'd been given a chance at redemption. Not complete redemption. 19 people had still died. 19 people who hadn't listened or hadn't been convinced or hadn't gotten the warning in time. Those deaths would haunt him alongside the 7 from Afghanistan. But 23 people had lived. 23 people were breathing because Marcus had built a round cabin and because he'd learned to trust a dog over data. He turned from the window and looked at Clay. "I knew because Atlas knew, and I built this cabin because I learned the hard way that sometimes the only way to survive is to stop building the way everyone else builds and start building the way the world requires." Clay stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Atlas, still sleeping near the door, exhausted from saving lives. That dog is smarter than every person in this valley put together, including me, Marcus said quietly. Especially me. I'm just the one who finally learned to listen. The barometer needle dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. Marcus Hayes stood on the porch of his round cabin, watching the instrument fall from 1,009 millibars to 985 in less than 6 hours. The morning had started cold and clear, the kind of December day that made Montana feel like a postcard of itself, all white peaks and blue sky and air so crisp it hurt to breathe. Now at 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had climbed 20 degrees. The sky had turned the color of old pennies, and Atlas wouldn't stop digging. The German shepherd had been at it since dawn, his front paws tearing into the frozen earth just beyond the cabin's foundation. The dog's injured hind leg made the work awkward, forced him to pivot and scrape with only 3 good limbs. But he didn't stop. He'd worn his pads raw, blood mixed with dirt under his claws. Every few minutes he'd pause, lift his head toward the eastern horizon, and release a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest. Deeper than bone, as if the sound originated in the same dark place where instinct lived. Marcus had seen this before. 5 years ago in Afghanistan, 6 hours before the Habub storm, Atlas had behaved exactly this way. The frantic digging, the fixed stare at nothing visible, the refusal to eat or rest or acknowledge any command. Back then, Marcus had reported it to his lieutenant and been told to get back to work. 7 men had died because Marcus hadn't known how to make people listen. Now, watching Atlas destroy his paws against the Montana hardpack, Marcus felt the old failure rising in his throat like bile. He checked his watch. 48 hours. That's how long the atmospheric pressure had been falling in ways that made no meteorological sense. He'd called the National Weather Service office in Missoula 3 times. Each time, a different person had told him the same thing. There were no storms in the forecast. The pressure readings were within normal variance for a winter Chinook wind pattern. Montana didn't get December tornadoes. He should relax, maybe take his medication, maybe talk to his VA counselor about why he was experiencing such severe anxiety. Marcus had stopped calling after that. He'd learned years ago that the world divided into 2 types of people: those who trusted data over experience, and those who'd survived situations where the data had been catastrophically wrong. The first group ran the weather service, and the government, and most of the visible machinery of modern life. The second group knew better than to waste breath arguing with them. Instead, Marcus had spent the last 2 days preparing. He'd reinforced every joint in the round cabin. He'd stocked extra water and medical supplies. He'd cleared a path from his door to the main road in case emergency vehicles needed access. And this morning, when Atlas's behavior had escalated from anxious to desperate, Marcus had made a decision. He was going to warn people, not through official channels, not through the authorities who'd already dismissed him. He was going to go door to door through Bitterroot Valley and tell every single resident that a storm was coming, that they needed to get underground, and that he didn't care if they believed him or called him crazy. He just needed them to be safe when the sky broke open. He'd printed 200 flyers on cheap paper at the library in town, using the last $20 in his wallet. The text was simple. Severe tornado risk. Seek underground shelter before 3 p.m. today. This is not a drill. He'd included his name and phone number at the bottom, though he suspected that would make people less likely to take it seriously rather than more. The crazy veteran with the roundhouse was exactly the kind of person folks learned to ignore. Marcus loaded the flyers into his truck, Atlas jumping into the passenger seat without being asked. The dog was shaking, his whole body trembling like he had a fever. But when Marcus tried to make him stay home, Atlas had simply stared at him with those brown eyes that had seen men die and then looked toward the road. Fine, Marcus had said, you can come. But if this turns into nothing, if I'm wrong and you're wrong, and we're both just damaged and paranoid, we're going to look like fools together. The valley spread below them as Marcus drove down from his property. 46 houses scattered across 3 square miles of ranch land and scrub pine. Most of them were old, built in the 1960s and 70s when land was cheap and people didn't worry much about building codes. Square structures with peaked roofs, the standard American design, practical and familiar, and completely vulnerable to lateral wind force. Marcus could see the weakness in everyone as he passed. The way corners created pressure points, the way flat walls became sails. In his mind, he could already picture them collapsing, could see the roofs lifting and the wall bowing inward, could hear the screaming of people trapped beneath tons of splintered wood. He started at the northern edge of the valley, at a ranch house where an older couple named the Harrisons lived. Marcus had met them once at the general store, had nodded politely while they had asked him pointed questions about his unusual construction project and whether he had proper permits. Now he walked up their gravel drive with a flyer in his hand and knocked on their door. Mrs. Harrison answered, a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and suspicious eyes. She looked at Marcus, then at the paper he was holding, and her expression hardened. "We're not interested in whatever you're selling," she said. "I'm not selling anything." Marcus held out the flyer. "There's a tornado coming. You need to get into your basement." Mrs. Harrison didn't take the paper. "Son, I've lived in this valley 62 years. We don't get tornadoes here." The atmospheric conditions are exactly right for one. The pressure has dropped 24 millibars since yesterday. The temperature is rising at an impossible rate for December. I'm telling you, something is coming, and it's going to be bad. Are you a meteorologist? No, ma'am. I'm just someone who's seen this before. Where? In your head? Mrs. Harrison stepped back and started to close the door. My husband and I don't appreciate being bothered by paranoid nonsense. If there was a real storm coming, we'd hear about it on the news. Now please leave our property. The door shut. Marcus stood there for a moment staring at the flyer in his hand. Then he walked back to his truck, drove to the next house, and tried again, and again, and again. By noon, he'd visited 30 houses. At 28 of them, people had refused to even take the flyer. Some had been polite about it, offering thin smiles and saying they appreciated his concern, but they were sure everything was fine. Others had been hostile, accusing him of trying to cause panic or seeking attention or suffering from mental illness that really ought to be treated professionally. One man, a rancher named Cooper, who Marcus had never met, had come out onto his porch with a shotgun and told Marcus that if he showed up spreading fear on Cooper's land again, there'd be consequences. At 2 houses, people had actually accepted the flyer. An elderly widow named Beth, who lived alone and seemed more lonely than concerned, and a young mother with 3 kids who'd looked at Marcus's face and seen something there that made her take him seriously. Those 2 houses gave him a tiny scrap of hope, 2 out of 30. If he could just get a few more people underground, if he could save even a handful when the storm hit, maybe that would start to balance the scales. Maybe that would be one small step toward redemption. Atlas rode beside him through all of it, his presence both comfort and reminder. The dog watched each house as they approached, and Marcus swore he could read judgment in those eyes. Not judgment of the people who refused to listen, but judgment of Marcus himself. "You know what's coming," the dog seemed to say. "You know, and you're letting them dismiss you. When will you stop asking permission to save lives?" At 1:30, Marcus pulled up to the largest property in the valley. 300 acres of ranch land, a 2-story house with a wraparound porch, barn, and outbuildings all painted the same deep red. Clay Brennan's place. The man who'd stood up at a community meeting 2 months ago and called Marcus's round cabin a menace to property values. The man who'd filed a formal complaint with the county about unpermitted construction. The man who, when Marcus had tried to explain the engineering principles behind circular architecture, had laughed and said he didn't need a lecture from someone who couldn't tell the difference between a house and a circus tent. Marcus sat in the truck for a long moment, engine idling, trying to decide if this was worth it. Clay Brennan hated him. That much was clear. The man had made it his personal mission to run Marcus out of the valley, or at least to make his life miserable enough that leaving seemed preferable to staying. Going to his door now would accomplish nothing except to give Clay more ammunition for whatever campaign of harassment he'd planned next. But Clay had an 8-year-old granddaughter, Emma. Marcus had seen her a few times, playing in the yard, riding her bike down the long driveway. She had blonde hair in 2 braids, and she'd waved at Atlas once, the kind of unself-conscious friendly gesture that children made before the world taught them to be cautious. And if Marcus drove past this house without trying, if he let pride or fear of humiliation stop him from knocking on that door, and if the storm came and something happened to that little girl, he would never forgive himself. 7 dead soldiers was already more weight than a soul should carry. He couldn't add a child to that burden. Marcus got out of the truck, Atlas jumped down beside him, three-legged gait carrying him toward the house with grim determination. They walked up the porch steps together, and Marcus knocked. Clay Brennan opened the door. He was a big man, 58 years old, 6'3", and 240 pounds of rancher muscle and stubborn certainty. He looked at Marcus, then at Atlas, and his expression went from surprise to angry in the space of a breath. "The hell are you doing on my property, Hayes?" Marcus held out a flyer. "There's a tornado coming. You need to take your granddaughter and get into your basement. Now." Clay didn't take the paper. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door partly closed behind him. His hand moved to his hip, and Marcus saw the outline of a holstered pistol under his jacket. "Are you threatening me?" Clay's voice had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. "No, sir. I'm warning you. The atmospheric pressure has been dropping all morning. The temperature is way too high. The sky is turning the wrong color. I've seen conditions like this before, and when I see them, people die. Please, just get Emma underground. That's all I'm asking." "Based on what? Your feelings?" Clay took a step forward. "Let me tell you something, Hayes. I've lived here my whole life. My father lived here. His father before him. We know this valley. We know the weather patterns. And we don't need some shell-shocked outsider coming around trying to scare people with ghost stories from whatever war zone scrambled his brain." Atlas growled. It was a low sound, barely audible, but Clay heard it, and his hand moved closer to his gun. "Control your animal," he said. "He's trying to tell you the same thing I am." Marcus kept his voice steady, kept his hands visible and non-threatening. "Something is wrong. You can't see it or hear it yet, but it's there. And in about 6 hours, it's going to tear across this valley. Please, I don't care what you think of me. Just take Emma somewhere safe." Clay's jaw clenched. "You want to know what I think of you? I think you're a coward who couldn't hack it in the military and came here looking for somewhere to hide. I think you built that freak show house because you're too broken to live like a normal person. And I think you're standing on my porch right now because you want attention. You want to feel important. You want someone to tell you that your paranoid delusions actually mean something. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell you to get off my land before I call the sheriff and have you arrested for trespassing and harassment." Behind Clay, through the gap in the doorway, Marcus could see Emma. She was standing in the hallway, a small figure in overalls and a pink shirt, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. She couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see her grandfather's anger, could see the strange man on the porch with his scarred dog. As Marcus watched, Emma moved closer to the door. Clay saw where Marcus was looking and stepped sideways, blocking the view. "Don't you dare look at my granddaughter. Don't you even think about her. You stay away from this house. You stay away from us. And if I see you anywhere near Emma, I will end you. Do you understand me?" Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not his resolve, but his last shred of hope that this could end any way except badly. He looked at Clay Brennan, at this man who loved his granddaughter enough to threaten murder, but not enough to consider that maybe, possibly, a veteran with PTSD might know something about danger that a rancher who'd never left Montana did not. "I understand," Marcus said quietly, "but I need you to understand something too. When I was in Afghanistan, I had a commanding officer who didn't listen to warnings. I reported danger and he told me I was wrong. I followed his orders because I'd been trained to follow orders, because I trusted that people in authority knew better than I did. And because of that, 7 men died, 7 men who had families and futures and reasons to live. They died because I wasn't strong enough to say no to someone who refused to hear the truth." Marcus took a breath. The air felt thick, harder to pull into his lungs than it should have been. "So I'm going to say this one more time, and then I'm going to leave, and whatever happens next is on both of us. There is a tornado coming to this valley. It will be here by 3 or 4 this afternoon. It will destroy everything in its path. And if you keep Emma in this house, with its square walls and flat roof and all its pretty corners for the wind to grab, she will die. You'll die too, probably, trying to protect her. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I warned you and you didn't listen, just like Lieutenant Drummond didn't listen. And that little girl will be one more ghost I can't save no matter how many times I see her face when I close my eyes." Clay's hand was on his gun now, actually gripping the handle. "Get out," he said. "Get out right now or I swear to God I will shoot you where you stand." Marcus turned to go. Atlas stood his ground for a moment longer, staring at Clay with something that looked disturbingly like judgment and then followed Marcus down the steps. They'd made it halfway to the truck when the door opened again. "Wait!" Marcus turned. Emma had come out onto the porch. She'd slipped past her grandfather, was standing at the railing with her small hands gripping the wood. Clay was right behind her, reaching to pull her back, but she twisted away. "Is the storm really coming?" Emma asked. Her voice was high and clear, a child's voice, but the question itself was adult in its directness. Marcus looked at her, this 8-year-old with blonde braids and serious eyes, and he couldn't lie. "Yes," he said, "it is." "How do you know?" Marcus glanced at Atlas. "Because he told me. He's never been wrong before." Emma looked at the dog, really looked, in the way children sometimes do when adults have stopped paying attention to what's actually in front of them. She saw the scars on his muzzle, the careful way he held his injured leg, the intensity in his gaze, and something in her expression changed. "I believe you," she said. Clay grabbed her shoulder. "Emma, get inside, now." "But Grandpa, what if he's right? What if the storm is coming?" "He's not right. He's sick. And we don't let sick people scare us with stories." Emma pulled away from Clay's grip, something Marcus would have bet she didn't do often. She was a well-behaved child. You could see it in the way she carried herself, the automatic deference to adult authority. But right now, standing on that porch with the strange copper-colored sky behind her, she looked at her grandfather and said the words that would save both their lives. "His dog isn't sick, and dogs don't lie." The silence that followed felt like a physical thing. Clay stared at his granddaughter. Emma stared back, and Marcus stood beside his truck, holding his breath, watching an 8-year-old girl do what he'd failed to do in Afghanistan. She was refusing to back down. She was insisting on being heard. She was saying that intuition and instinct mattered as much as authority and tradition, maybe more, and she was doing it without fear or hesitation, because she hadn't yet learned that speaking truth to power had consequences. Clay's face went through several expressions in quick succession: anger, confusion, something that might have been fear. He looked at Marcus, then at Atlas, then back at Emma. His hand fell away from his gun. "If you're wrong about this," Clay said slowly, "if there's no storm and you've just scared my granddaughter for nothing, I will destroy you. I will sue you for every penny you have. I will make sure everyone in 3 counties knows you're a delusional liar. I will ruin your life. Do you understand?" Marcus understood. He nodded. "But if you're right," Clay's voice cracked slightly, "if this is real and you're trying to save us, then Emma goes into the basement, and I go with her, and we wait until you tell us it's safe to come out." 3 o'clock, Marcus said. "If it's coming, it'll be here by then. Maybe sooner." Clay looked at Emma. She was still standing at the railing, watching Atlas. The dog had moved closer to the porch, was sitting at attention now, and Emma had noticed something that Marcus had trained himself to see years ago. Atlas's ears were locked forward, pointed northeast. His body was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that came before explosive action. Every muscle was tensed. He looked like a statue of vigilance, like an animal carved from stone by someone who understood that survival meant constant watching. "Emma," Clay said quietly, "go get your coat and your shoes. We're going to the basement." The girl disappeared into the house. Clay stood on the porch for another long moment, looking at Marcus with an expression that contained too many emotions to name. "I hope you're wrong," he said finally, "for your sake." "I hope I'm wrong too," Marcus replied, "but I'm not." He drove away from Clay Brennan's ranch with his hands shaking on the steering wheel. That was the hard part about this, the part nobody talked about when they talked about being right in the face of disbelief. Being right meant that terrible things were actually going to happen. It meant that your worst fears were justified and your paranoia was simply accurate threat assessment, and the world was exactly as dangerous as your trauma had taught you it was. Part of Marcus desperately wanted to be wrong, to be the crazy veteran everyone thought he was, to have this day end with nothing but embarrassment and an "I told you so" from people who'd never understand the terror of being proven correct. But Atlas was still shaking, the barometer was still falling, and the sky had gone from copper to a shade of greenish yellow that made Marcus's stomach clench with remembered horror. He drove back to his cabin and parked the truck facing downhill, ready for quick departure if needed. He carried his emergency supplies inside, then came back out to watch the eastern horizon. Atlas stood beside him, both of them staring at the sky like it was an enemy that could be intimidated into retreat. At 2:15, the wind stopped completely. One moment there was the normal December breeze, Cold air moving down from the peaks, and the next there was nothing. The trees went still. The tall grass stopped swaying. Even the sound seemed to disappear, leaving a silence so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Atlas whined. It was a high, frightened sound, the kind of noise Marcus had heard once before in a desert half a world away. The dog pressed against his leg, trembling so hard his tags rattled. "I know, buddy," Marcus whispered. "I know." At 2:30, the temperature spiked again. Marcus watched the thermometer outside his door climb from 45 degrees to 63 in less than 20 minutes. The air felt wrong, too thick and too warm, and charged with something that made the hair on his arms stand up. It was the feeling you got right before lightning struck close by, that sense of electricity looking for a path to ground. At 2:45, the sky turned green. Not the gentle green of spring grass or forest canopy, but a sick, bruised green like infected flesh. Marcus had seen this exact color once before, through the window of a concrete bunker, while sand stripped paint from metal outside. It was the color that air turned when normal physics stopped applying, when atmospheric pressure differentials became so extreme that light itself refracted wrong. He pulled out his phone and called the National Weather Service one final time. A recorded message played, something about checking their website for updates. No current warnings or watches in effect for western Montana. Marcus hung up without leaving a message. There was no point. By the time anyone official acknowledged what was happening, it would already be over. At 2:50, Atlas barked. It was a single sharp sound, an alarm, and then the dog bolted. He ran down the slope toward the valley, toward the houses, his three good legs carrying him faster than Marcus would have thought possible. Marcus ran after him, shouting the dog's name. But Atlas didn't stop. He ran straight to the valley floor, to the scattered houses, and he started barking at doors. Marcus caught up with him at the first house, the Harrisons' place. Atlas was on their porch, barking and scratching at the door with frantic urgency. Inside, Marcus could see Mrs. Harrison peering out through a curtain, her face frightened and angry at the same time. She didn't open the door. Atlas moved to the next house, and the next. At each one he barked and scratched, trying to wake people up, trying to make them understand that danger was coming in a language beyond words. Some doors stayed closed, some opened briefly and slammed shut again. But at 3 houses, people came outside. Beth, the elderly widow, the young mother with 3 children, and a family Marcus didn't know, a man and woman in their 40s who looked at Atlas's desperate behavior and then looked at the sky and made a decision based on nothing but the fact that a dog was afraid. Those 5 people, Beth and the mother and her 3 kids and the couple, they listened when Marcus shouted at them to get underground immediately. They went to basements and storm cellars, and Marcus helped them secure the doors. And in doing so, he saved their lives, though he didn't know it yet. At 3:05, the first sound reached them. It came from the northeast, from the direction Atlas had been staring on, and it was like nothing Marcus had heard outside of war. A low rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself, rising into a roar that had weight and substance, like something solid moving through the air fast enough to compress atmosphere into a wall. The sound had teeth. It had claws. It wanted to tear things apart, and it was getting closer. Marcus grabbed Atlas and ran back uphill to the cabin. The dog fought him at first, still trying to reach more houses, but Marcus dragged him bodily toward the round structure, and finally Atlas understood and ran with him instead of against him. They made it inside with maybe 90 seconds to spare. Marcus slammed the curved door shut, engaged the vacuum seal he'd installed based on submarine hatch designs, and dropped to the floor with Atlas pressed against his chest. The tornado hit at 3:07 and 12 seconds. Marcus knew the exact time because he was watching his watch, had been conditioned by years of military training to note when things went wrong so that after-action reports could be accurate. The cabin shuddered. The walls creaked. The air pressure inside dropped so fast Marcus's ears popped painfully and blood vessels burst in his nose. He could taste copper. He could feel the building trying to lift off its foundation, held down only by the anchoring system he had spent 6 weeks installing. Steel cables driven 8 feet into bedrock and connected to the frame at 40 points around the circle. The sound was worse than the pressure. It wasn't just loud, it was omnipresent, a roar that came from every direction at once, above and below and inside and outside. It sounded like the world ending. It sounded like God's wrath made audible. And underneath it, Marcus could hear other sounds. Wood splintering, metal shrieking, things that had been solid becoming debris. Houses dying. He buried his face against Atlas's fur and counted. 1, 2, 3, 4. The dog was rigid in his arms, every muscle locked, breathing in short panicked gasps. 5, 6, 7, 8. The curved walls flexed but held, bending inward under the pressure but not breaking, designed to give just enough without failing. 9, 10, 11, 12. Something huge hit the cabin from the east. The impact so violent it knocked Marcus sideways even though he was already on the floor. A tree trunk, probably, or part of a building, thrown like a javelin by winds that move faster than a race car. The round wall deflected it, sent it spinning away into the vortex. 13, 14, 15. Marcus thought about Clay Brennan and Emma in their basement. He thought about the 5 people Atlas had convinced to seek shelter. He thought about all the others who'd refused to listen, and he prayed without believing in anything to pray to that they'd found safety anyway. That maybe they'd changed their minds. That maybe his warnings had planted seeds that bloomed into action when the sky finally proved him right. 20, 21, 22. The windows on the north side exploded inward, safety glass turning into a million pieces of shrapnel. Marcus covered Atlas with his body, felt fragments hit his back, sharp stings that meant cuts, but probably nothing serious. The vacuum seal on the door groaned, but held. 23, 24, 25. The pressure differential was trying to pull the air out of his lungs. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, to resist the urge to gasp and pant. He'd read about this, how rapid decompression could cause pulmonary barotrauma, could rupture the delicate tissues in the lungs. Stay calm, breathe steady, trust the engineering. 26, 27, 28. And then it began to ease. The roar shifted direction, moved away toward the south. The pressure started to equalize. The cabin stopped shaking. Marcus kept counting anyway, kept his arms around Atlas, kept his eyes squeezed shut because if he opened them and saw that the walls had failed, that they were about to, after coming so close to survival, he didn't think he could handle it. 40, 41, 42. The sound was definitely receding now. Still audible, but no longer overwhelming. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. Silence. The kind of silence that comes after violence, when the world is shocked into stillness, when nothing dares to move or breathe or make a sound for fear that the monster might come back. Marcus lay on the floor of his round cabin with his geek in his arms and listened to that silence for a full minute before he dared to open his eyes. The cabin was still standing, damaged, but standing. The windows were gone. One section of the wall had a crack running through it. The door hung slightly askew on its hinges, but the structure itself was intact. The circle had held. Marcus sat up slowly. His back stung where glass had hit him. His ears were ringing. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unbuckle the vacuum seal on the door. But he managed it, pushed the door open, and looked out at Bitterroot Valley. Nothing. There was nothing left. The tornado had carved a path half a mile wide straight through the center of the populated area, and every single square structure in that path had been erased. Not collapsed, not damaged, but erased, reduced to scattered kindling and shattered fragments so small you couldn't tell what they'd been before. The earth was scraped bare, topsoil ripped away, leaving only the pale clay underneath. It looked like the surface of an alien planet, lifeless and sterile and wrong. Atlas pushed past Marcus and limped out into the devastation. The dog moved carefully through the debris, nose down, searching. Marcus followed, his mind not quite able to process what he was seeing. 46 houses, 46 families, all of it gone in 47 seconds. They found Clay Brennan's house first, or what had been Clay Brennan's house. The structure was gone completely, vanished, leaving only the foundation in a debris field that extended 200 yards in every direction. But Clay had a basement, Marcus remembered. Clay had taken Emma underground. They might have survived. They had to have survived. Marcus ran to where the basement entrance should have been. It was buried under 3 feet of rubble. Boards and siding and insulation and twisted metal all piled on top of the door. He started digging with his bare hands, throwing pieces aside, calling Clay's name. Atlas joined him, using his front paws to scrape away smaller pieces. It took 20 minutes to clear enough rubble to reach the door. The handle had been torn off. Marcus got his fingers into the gap and pulled, muscles screaming, and the door opened. Dark stairs led down into black space. "Clay?" Marcus called. "Emma?" For a moment there was nothing. Then he heard movement in the darkness, and Clay Brennan's voice, hoarse and shaking, said, "Are we alive?" "You're alive," Marcus confirmed. "Come on up, it's over." Clay came up first, one arm bleeding from a deep cut, his face white with shock. Then Emma, covered in dust, but apparently unharmed. The girl climbed out of the basement, looked around at the destroyed world, and started to cry. Clay pulled her against his chest, and the big rancher who'd threatened to shoot Marcus less than an hour ago stood in the ruins of his home with tears running down his face. "You were right," Clay whispered. "Oh God, you were right." Marcus didn't have words for that. He just nodded and moved on to search for other survivors. Atlas led the way, his nose guiding them through the wreckage. They found Beth trapped under a fallen wall section, her hip broken but alive. They found the young mother and her 3 children in their basement, frightened but safe. They found the couple who'd listened to Atlas, emerged from their storm cellar to find their house gone, but their lives intact. And they found others. A teenage boy pinned under an overturned truck, an elderly man who'd been in his garage when the tornado hit, now buried under the collapsed structure. A woman trapped in her bathroom, the only room that hadn't been completely destroyed. Marcus pulled them out one by one, with Atlas guiding him to anyone who made a sound or a movement. By the time emergency services finally arrived 3 hours later, they'd found 23 people alive. But there were others who hadn't made it. 19 confirmed dead in the final count, though some bodies weren't recovered for days. Mrs. Harrison and her husband, who'd stayed in their living room because they didn't believe in tornado warnings from crazy veterans. The rancher named Cooper, who'd been in his truck trying to drive away from the storm. A family of 4 who'd lived at the eastern edge of the valley, who probably never even heard the warnings because their house was too far from the center of town. 19 dead, 23 alive, and 1 round cabin still standing in the middle of complete destruction, proving what Marcus had known all along. That corners were weaknesses. That curves were strength. That following orders and trusting authority could get you killed if the people in charge were wrong. That listening to a dog who dug at the earth and stared at the wrong-colored sky could save your life. If you were brave enough or desperate enough or young enough to believe that wisdom didn't only come from official sources. As the sun set on the devastated valley, Marcus sat on the steps of his cabin with Clay Brennan beside him. Emma was inside with the other survivors, wrapped in emergency blankets provided by the FEMA team that had finally helicoptered in. Atlas lay between them, his head on Marcus's lap, exhausted past the point of movement. Clay hadn't spoken for an hour. He just sat there, staring at the place where his house used to be. Finally, as the light faded to purple twilight, he turned to Marcus. "I killed them," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man stating a fact. "All the people who didn't listen, who stayed in their houses because I stood up at that community meeting and called you crazy. I'm the one they trusted. I'm the one who told them you were wrong. I killed 19 people." Marcus wanted to say something comforting, wanted to offer absolution, but he couldn't, because Clay was partly right. The mockery and dismissal had cost lives. But it wasn't only Clay's fault, and it wasn't fair for him to carry all of it. "They killed themselves," Marcus said quietly, "by refusing to consider that someone might know something they didn't, by trusting comfort over caution, by believing that disasters only happen to other people in other places. You didn't help, but you didn't kill them. They chose not to listen." But Emma listened. Clay's voice cracked. "An 8-year-old girl looked at your dog and understood something that 58 years of life didn't teach me." "What does that say about me?" "It says you're human," Marcus replied. "It says you did what most people do. You trusted the familiar over the strange. You believed in the world as you'd always known it instead of the world as it actually was. And when someone you loved made you question that, you changed your mind. That's more than most people manage." Clay turned to look at him. His eyes were red, whether from crying or from dust or from exhaustion, Marcus couldn't tell. "How many times have you been right when everyone said you were wrong?" Marcus thought about Afghanistan, about the Habub storm, about Lieutenant Drummond who'd checked the official forecast and seen no danger. About 7 men buried in sand because Marcus had followed orders instead of instinct. Twice, he said, once when it was too late to matter, and once today. They sat in silence for a while longer. Emergency lights were being set up in the valley below, generators roaring to life, the machinery of disaster response beginning its work. Soon someone would come up to the cabin and want to interview Marcus, want to know how he'd predicted the tornado, want to understand why his building was the only one that survived. He'd have to explain again and again to officials and reporters, and eventually to lawyers and investigators, and most of them still wouldn't believe him. They'd say he got lucky. They'd say the tornado happened to miss his structure. They'd say correlation wasn't causation, and one anecdotal example didn't prove anything about circular architecture. But Clay Brennan would believe him, and Emma, and 23 people who'd been inside that round cabin or underground because Atlas had barked at their doors. That would have to be enough. It would have to be redemption enough for Afghanistan, for the 7 men Marcus couldn't save, for all the times he'd been too weak or too conditioned or too afraid to insist on being heard when lives depended on it. Atlas stirred against his lap. The dog lifted his head, looked at Marcus with those brown eyes that had seen so much, and then collapsed again. Marcus ran his hand along the dog's ribs, feeling the heartbeat under fur and muscle, steady and strong and alive. "Thank you," he whispered, "for being right when I needed you to be, for not giving up even when no one would listen, for saving these people when I couldn't save the others." Atlas didn't respond. He just closed his eyes and slept, there on the steps of the only house left standing, under a sky that had finally returned to its proper color, in a valley that would never be the same and never forget the 47 seconds when the world ended and began again. The television crews arrived at dawn, 48 hours after the tornado turned Bitterroot Valley into a graveyard of splintered wood and broken dreams. Marcus Hayes woke to the sound of helicopter rotors, multiple aircraft circling low over his round cabin like mechanical vultures drawn to catastrophe. He rose from the floor where he'd been sleeping, every muscle in his body stiff and aching, and looked out through the shattered window frame at a landscape transformed by national attention. 3 news vans were parked at the base of his hill, satellite dishes pointed at the sky. A woman in a red blazer stood in front of a camera, gesturing at the cabin behind her, her mouth moving silently because Marcus couldn't hear her words through the broken glass. Behind her, the valley stretched flat and empty except for emergency vehicles and the scattered foundations where houses used to stand. And in the center of all that destruction, rising from the dirt like a monument to stubbornness or genius or pure dumb luck, depending on who you asked, was Marcus's round cabin, the only structure still standing, the only proof that a different way of building could mean the difference between life and death. Atlas limped over to Marcus's side, his injured leg worse this morning after 2 days of constant movement through rubble. The dog's paws were wrapped in bandages that the FEMA veterinarian had applied yesterday, white gauze already stained with blood where the damaged pads had started seeping again. Marcus knelt and ran his hands along the dog's ribs, feeling for injuries beyond the obvious ones. Atlas was 7 years old now, no longer young, and the last 48 hours had pushed him past any reasonable limit. He should have been resting. Instead, he'd worked until his body quit, dragging people from wreckage, and now he was paying the price. "We need to get you to a real vet," Marcus said quietly. "Not just a field medic, someone who can do surgery if you need it." Atlas licked Marcus's hand but didn't take his eyes off the activity below. The dog was still watching, still alert, as if danger might return at any moment, and he needed to be ready. Marcus understood that feeling. He'd carried it for 5 years, ever since Afghanistan. That permanent state of vigilance that never quite let you relax even when logic said the threat was gone. Trauma didn't care about logic. It cared about keeping you alive. And if that meant staying tense and afraid forever, well, at least you'd be a living wreck instead of a dead hero. Someone knocked on the cabin door. Marcus opened it to find a man in his early 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a FEMA vest over business casual clothes. Behind him stood 2 others, a woman with a tablet and a younger man carrying what looked like surveying equipment. "Mr. Hayes, I'm David Chen, structural engineer with FEMA. We'd like to inspect your building if you'll allow it. Try to understand why it survived when nothing else did." Marcus stepped aside. "Come in. Just watch the glass on the floor." They spent 2 hours measuring and photographing and taking samples of wood and concrete. David Chen ran his hands along the curved walls with something close to reverence, muttering calculations under his breath. The woman with the tablet recorded everything, her stylus flying across the screen. The younger man set up a laser level and confirmed what Marcus already knew. Despite wind speeds estimated at over 200 miles per hour, despite a direct hit from an EF4 tornado, despite 47 seconds of force that had erased every other structure in a half-mile radius, the cabin was perfectly plumb. The walls hadn't shifted. The foundation hadn't cracked. The circle had held. Finally, David Chen turned to Marcus. "Where did you study architecture?" "I didn't. I was an army engineer. I built bridges and bunkers, mostly." "Where did you learn to do this?" Chen gestured at the curved beams, the way they interlocked without nails, held together by tension and geometry rather than brute force. "Afghanistan," Marcus said. "From a man who's dead now." He showed me sketches of traditional circular homes that had survived for centuries. I taught myself the rest. "You taught yourself." Chen's voice carried no mockery, only a kind of tired amazement. "You taught yourself how to build a structure that exceeds tornado resistance standards by a factor of 3. Do you understand how remarkable that is?" "I understand that it works," Marcus replied. "That's all I needed to know." The FEMA team left with promises to return, to study the design further, to possibly incorporate Marcus's techniques into new building codes. Marcus watched them go and felt nothing. No pride, no vindication, just a hollow exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. 46 houses destroyed, 19 people dead, and everyone wanted to know about the engineering miracle, about the incredible round cabin, about Marcus Hayes, the visionary builder who'd predicted disaster and survived it. No one wanted to talk about the 19 families planning funerals. No one wanted to ask why a veteran with PTSD had been the only person in the valley who'd taken atmospheric warnings seriously. No one wanted to examine the arrogance that had made an entire community ignore a man just because he seemed broken and strange. By noon, the reporters had found a way up to the cabin. Marcus refused to talk to them. He stood on his porch with Atlas beside him and said no comment over and over until they finally retreated, disappointed but not deterred. They'd get their story one way or another. If not from him, then from the survivors. From Clay Brennan, who was already being interviewed on CNN. From the 23 people who'd sheltered in the round cabin and lived to tell about it. Marcus walked down to the valley to check on those survivors. They'd been moved to emergency housing, a cluster of FEMA trailers set up at the edge of what used to be town. Clay was there, his arm in a sling, sitting outside one of the trailers with Emma beside him. The girl was drawing in a sketchbook, her blonde braids falling forward as she concentrated. She looked up when Atlas approached, and her face transformed from concentration to joy. "Atlas!" She dropped the sketchbook and threw her arms around the dog's neck. Atlas stood still and let her hug him, his tail wagging slowly despite the pain he must have been in. Emma pulled back and looked at his bandaged paws. "Does it hurt?" "Probably," Marcus said. "But he won't complain. He's not built that way." Emma touched the bandages gently, as if she could heal them through simple kindness. "You saved everyone. You're the bravest dog in the whole world." Clay stood up from his chair. His face looked older than it had 3 days ago, carved with new lines of grief and guilt. He watched his granddaughter with the sword for a moment, then gestured for Marcus to follow him away from the trailer, out of Emma's earshot. They walked to the edge of the trailer camp, where the ground began to slope up toward the mountains. Clay pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket, offered one to Marcus, then lit one for himself when Marcus shook his head. He smoked in silence for a while, staring out at the empty valley. "The lawyers came this morning," Clay said finally. 3 different firms. All of them want to represent the families in a lawsuit. "Against who?" "Against you." Marcus had been expecting this, but hearing it still felt like a punch to the gut. "What's the claim?" "That you knew the tornado was coming and didn't warn people properly. That you had information that could have saved lives and you kept it to yourself. That if you'd gone to the authorities earlier, if you'd made more noise, if you'd been more insistent, 19 people might still be alive." "I went door to door," Marcus said quietly. "I printed flyers with my own money. I called the weather service 3 times. I tried everything short of physically dragging people underground." "I know that." Clay took another drag on his cigarette. "I told them that. But these lawyers, they're saying it doesn't matter what you tried. They're saying you had special knowledge, that you're an engineer with military training, that you had a professional obligation to do more, to call the sheriff, to trigger the emergency broadcast system, to make such a fuss that people couldn't ignore you. How exactly was I supposed to do that? Marcus could feel anger rising in his chest, hot and bitter. I'm a veteran with PTSD who everyone thought was crazy. If I'd gone to the sheriff and demanded they evacuate the valley based on my dog's behavior, they would have locked me up for psychological evaluation. Clay stubbed out his cigarette. I know. God help me, I know. I'm not saying the lawsuit has merit. I'm saying it's coming. These families need someone to blame. And you're the easiest target. The weird loner who predicted disaster and survived while their loved ones died. It doesn't matter that you tried to warn them. It matters that they're dead and you're alive and your house is still standing. They stood in silence for a moment. Below them, emergency workers were beginning the process of clearing debris. Heavy machinery rolled across the torn earth, scooping up splintered wood and twisted metal. The sound carried up the slope, a mechanical grinding that would continue for weeks. There's something else, Clay said. The insurance companies are refusing to pay out. Why? Because most of the houses were old enough that they didn't meet current building codes. The policies have clauses about code compliance. Without it, they're saying the damage isn't covered. These people lost everything, and now they're being told they won't get a penny to rebuild. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. So what are they going to do? Clay met his eyes. Some are leaving, going to stay with family in other states, starting over somewhere else. But most of them want to stay. This is home. Their parents are buried here. Their memories are here. They don't want to abandon the valley just because one storm destroyed it. What do they need? Help. Someone to teach them how to build something that won't blow away next time. Someone who knows how to make a structure that can survive. You're asking me to help rebuild, Marcus said slowly. After they're suing me. I'm not asking, Clay replied. I'm telling you it's going to happen whether you participate or not. The question is whether you want to be part of it, whether you want to make sure these people learn from what happened, or whether you want to sit up in your cabin and let them rebuild the same way they built before and wait for the next storm to kill them. Marcus looked down at the valley, at the empty foundations and the people moving through the ruins like ants rebuilding after someone had stepped out on their hill. Part of him wanted to walk away, to take Atlas and leave Montana, find somewhere quieter, somewhere people wouldn't look at him and see either a miracle or a liability. But he thought about Emma drawing in her sketchbook, about the way she'd hugged Atlas like the debris was the only solid thing in a world turned liquid. He thought about the 19 dead and how their deaths would be meaningless if nothing changed, if the survivors just rebuilt their square houses and waited for history to repeat itself. I'll help, Marcus said, but I want something in return. Clay nodded. Name it. Drop the lawsuit. All of them. Tell those families that suing me won't bring anyone back and it won't make their new houses any stronger. Tell them I'll teach them everything I know for free if they'll just stop trying to make me responsible for deaths I tried to prevent. I'll talk to them, Clay said, but I can't promise anything. Grief makes people irrational. They need someone to be angry at, and right now you're it. Then I'll live with that, Marcus replied, but I'm not going to let them die again because they're too angry to learn. The first community meeting happened in a FEMA tent 3 days later. 78 people showed up, everyone who'd lived in the valley and survived, plus a few who'd been away when the tornado hit and came back to find their homes gone. Marcus stood at the front of the tent with a roll of architectural drawings spread on a folding table. Atlas lay at his feet, still too injured to stand for long periods but refusing to be left behind. A man in his 50s stood up as soon as Marcus began to speak. You got a lot of nerve showing your face here. My sister died because you didn't warn us properly. I warned everyone I could reach, Marcus said quietly. I'm sorry it wasn't enough. You're sorry? The man's voice cracked. You knew that storm was coming and you let us die. You sat up in your fancy round house and watched us get killed. Clay Brennan stood. That's not what happened, Ray. Marcus went door to door. He came to my house and I pulled a gun on him. I told him to leave. If anyone's responsible for people not listening, it's me. I'm the one they trusted. I'm the one who called him crazy. We all called him crazy, someone else said. A woman in her 60s, her arm in a cast. Because building a roundhouse is crazy. Normal people don't do that. Normal people also die in tornadoes, Marcus said. He unrolled the first drawing on the table. This is a basic circular structure, 24 feet in diameter. It can be built with standard lumber and basic tools. It requires no special materials and no advanced skills. And it can withstand wind speeds up to 250 miles per hour. That's EF5 tornado resistance. That's hurricane proof. That's stronger than anything else you can build for the same cost. The tent went quiet. People moved closer to look at the drawings. Marcus watched them study the curved walls, the arched roof, the way forces distributed around a circle instead of concentrating at corners. He could see doubt in their faces, resistance born from lifetimes of seeing houses built one way and being told that way was right. But he could also see curiosity, desperate hope, the beginning of understanding that maybe, possibly, the old ways had been wrong and a better way existed. A younger man raised his hand. How long does it take to build? Depends on how many people are working. One person alone, maybe 3 months. 10 people working together, 3 weeks. The beauty of circular construction is that it's modular. Every section is identical. Once you learn one part, you can replicate it around the circle. What about con? Less than a standard house. You need fewer materials because the structure is self-supporting. No load-bearing walls, no complex roof trusses, just curves and tension and geometry. What about permits? This was an older woman, her voice sharp with bureaucratic concern. The county won't approve non-standard construction. Then we change the county regulations, Clay said. We make them approve it, or we build without permits and dare them to come tear down houses that actually keep people alive. That's illegal, someone protested. So is dying because you followed stupid rules, Clay shot back. My house was legal. My house was up to code. My house killed my son's wife 2 years ago when a winter storm collapsed the roof under snow load. Legal doesn't mean safe. Code compliant doesn't mean good. If we have to break some regulations to build houses that actually protect our families, then that's what we're going to do. The meeting went on for 3 hours. Arguments and objections, and slow, painful consensus building. By the end, 42 families had agreed to try building circular homes. 36 were still resistant, preferring to relocate or to rebuild square houses somewhere else. It was a start. Not the unified community Marcus had hoped for, but enough to prove the concept, enough to create a model that others might follow. Construction began in early January, 2 weeks after the tornado. The valley was still being cleared of debris, but Marcus had identified stable ground where new foundations could be poured. He organized the 42 families into work crews, teaching them in groups of 8 how to bend wood with steam, how to calculate the curve radius for maximum strength, how to join beams without nails using old timber framing techniques that had been forgotten when mass production made everything uniform and easy and weak. Clay Brennan worked beside Marcus every day, his injured arm healing slowly but not stopping him from doing what he could with one hand. He'd become something between a foreman and a disciple, helping organize supplies, mediating disputes between families, and quietly reminding people that Marcus Hayes had tried to save them even when they'd spit in his face. The big rancher had lost 70 pounds since the tornado. He barely ate. He worked until exhaustion forced him to stop, and then he'd sleep a few hours and start again. It was penance, Marcus understood. Clay was trying to build his way out of guilt, trying to construct forgiveness one curved beam at a time. Emma came to the work site most days after school. The valley had set up a temporary classroom in one of the FEMA trailers, and when lessons ended at 3, she'd walk to wherever the construction was happening and spend hours watching the men work. She drew pictures of the round houses taking shape, detailed sketches that showed an 8-year-old's understanding of what made them special. And she stayed close to Atlas, who'd become her unofficial guardian. The dog couldn't work anymore, his injuries too severe, but he could lie in the sun near the construction and let Emma lean against him while she drew, and that seemed to be enough purpose to keep him going. The first house was completed on February 14th, Valentine's Day, though no one had planned that timing. It belonged to Beth, the elderly widow who'd been trapped under rubble and survived because Marcus had dug her out. She stood outside her new home with tears running down her weathered face, one hand touching the curved wall as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "It looks like a lighthouse," she said, "like something that guides people home through the dark." "That's exactly what it is," Marcus replied. "A light in the storm. Proof that we can build better if we're willing to learn." Beth invited everyone to dinner that night in her new round house. 20 people crowded into the single room, sitting on the floor because there wasn't furniture yet, eating potluck dishes brought from the FEMA trailers. It felt like a celebration and a wake at the same time, joy mixed with the absence of those who should have been there, but weren't. 19 empty places that would never be filled. Marcus sat with his back against the curved wall, Atlas's head in his lap. Across the room, Emma was telling a group of kids about how Marcus had built the first round cabin, how he'd worked alone for months, how everyone had laughed at him. She told the story like it was a fairy tale. The hero who knew the truth and was mocked for it until the day of reckoning proved him right. Marcus wanted to tell her it wasn't that simple, that being right didn't erase the dead, that vindication was a hollow comfort when you were still haunted by the faces of people you couldn't save. But he stayed quiet and let her have her story. Children needed heroes, and maybe in a small way, he'd earned the right to be one. By March, 11 round houses stood in the valley. By April, 20. The work went faster as people learned, as techniques were refined, as the community developed a shared understanding of how circular construction worked. News crews came back to document the rebuilding. Architecture professors from universities across the country requested permission to study the structures. The governor of Montana visited, shook Marcus's hand, and promised state funding to support the project. But not everyone was celebrating. The lawsuit moved forward despite Clay's efforts to stop it. 6 families, those who'd lost multiple members in the tornado, had hired a lawyer from Billings who specialized in negligence cases. The claim was simple. Marcus Hayes had superior knowledge of impending disaster and failed to adequately communicate that knowledge to authorities who could have mandated evacuation. His failure to follow proper channels had resulted in preventable deaths. The families sought $10 million in damages. The deposition happened in late April, in a conference room in Missoula. Marcus sat across a table from a lawyer in an expensive suit who asked him the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, trying to trap him into admitting fault. Did you know the tornado was coming? Yes. Did you contact law enforcement? No. Did you contact emergency management services? No. Did you make any effort to trigger the official warning system? No. Why not, Mr. Hayes? Because they wouldn't have listened. Because I'm a veteran with PTSD and everyone thinks I'm unreliable. Because the Weather Service had already told me there was no danger and any further calls would be considered harassment. Because I'd learned from experience that official channels don't work when you're trying to report something that doesn't fit the official model of how the world works. So you took it upon yourself to warn people individually? Yes, and 19 people died anyway. Marcus looked at the lawyer, at this man who'd never been to Afghanistan, who'd never watched friends die in a storm that authorities said couldn't happen, who probably went home every night to a square house with square corners and slept peacefully because he'd never been proven catastrophically wrong about something that mattered. 19 people died because they didn't believe me, Marcus said quietly. They didn't believe me because I'm different and strange, and I build weird houses. They didn't believe me because, in their experience, veterans with trauma are broken and unreliable. They didn't believe me because trusting official sources is easier than thinking for yourself, and they died for that choice. Not because I failed to warn them, but because they failed to listen. The deposition went on for 4 more hours. By the end, Marcus's voice was hoarse and his hands were shaking. Clay drove him back to Bitterroot Valley in silence. When they reached the round cabin, Clay finally spoke. You did good in there. You told the truth. Truth doesn't matter in court, Marcus said. What matters is who the jury believes. And they're going to believe that a trained engineer should have done more, should have tried harder, should have found a way to make people listen. Clay pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. This came for you yesterday. I didn't want to give it to you before the deposition. Marcus unfolded the paper. It was a letter handwritten from a woman named Sarah, whose husband had died in the tornado. The letter was short. It said that she didn't blame Marcus, that her husband had been stubborn and foolish and had refused to listen despite her begging him to go to the basement. She said Marcus had tried to save him, and that was more than most people would have done. She said the lawsuit was wrong and she'd refused to join it. And she said thank you for building something beautiful out of tragedy, for teaching her neighbors that there were better ways to live, and for giving her young son hope that the future could be different from the past. Marcus read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. One letter, he said, out of 19 families. I'll take it. The trial was scheduled for September, 6 months away. Marcus tried not to think about it. He focused on the work, on teaching more families how to build, on watching the valley transform from a disaster zone into something that looked almost like a community again. By summer, 38 round houses stood where 46 square ones had been. The 8 families who'd chosen not to rebuild in Bitterroot had sold their land, most of it bought by people who'd heard about the circular construction project and wanted to be part of something revolutionary. In July, something unexpected happened. The National Weather Service issued a public statement acknowledging that their forecasting models had failed to predict the December tornado. They announced a new initiative to study atmospheric conditions in mountain valleys, to better understand how winter tornado formation could occur in places previously thought immune. And they specifically cited Marcus Hayes's observations about barometric pressure and sky color as examples of localized warning signs that their instruments had missed. It wasn't an apology. It was careful bureaucratic language that admitted error without accepting blame. But it was enough to shift the narrative. Suddenly, Marcus wasn't the crazy veteran who'd gotten lucky. He was the citizen scientist who'd noticed what the professionals had missed. News outlets that had been skeptical started running stories about the limits of modern meteorology, about the value of indigenous and traditional knowledge, about how sometimes the people closest to the land understood it better than the satellites and computer models. The lawsuit fell apart in August. The lawyer from Billings withdrew, citing insufficient evidence of negligence. 4 of the 6 families dropped their claims. The remaining 2 settled out of court for undisclosed amounts that Marcus suspected came from Clay Brennan's own pocket, though the rancher refused to confirm it. The threat of financial ruin lifted like fog burning off in morning sun, and Marcus could breathe again without feeling like every breath was stolen from someone who deserved it more. By September, as the anniversary of the tornado approached, Bitterroot Valley had transformed completely. 42 round houses stood in clusters, grouped by families who'd worked together during construction and formed bonds stronger than the ones that had existed before disaster. The houses were all slightly different, individualized by their builders. Some painted bright colors, while others showed natural wood, some with large windows, while others prioritized storm protection. But they were all circles, all curves, all structures that said we learned from death and chose to build differently. Marcus stood on the hill above his original cabin, looking down at what had been created. Atlas stood beside him, moving better now after surgery on his injured leg, though he'd never run again the way he once had. The dog was grayer around the muzzle. He slept more, but his eyes were still alert, still watchful, still scanning the horizon for threats that might never come. Clay walked up the hill to join them. Emma ran ahead, 9 years old now, her blonde braids bouncing. She'd grown 3 inches over the summer and lost 1 front tooth. She carried a rolled-up piece of paper in her hands. "Look what I made." She unrolled the paper to show a drawing. It depicted the valley from above, all 42 round houses arranged like a constellation, with Marcus's original cabin at the center like a North Star. Around the edges, she'd drawn mountains and trees, and a sky that was blue instead of green. In the bottom corner, carefully printed in a child's handwriting, were the words, "The Valley That Learned." "That's beautiful, Emma," Marcus said. "Is that for school?" "No, it's for you." She handed him the drawing. "Because you taught us, you and Atlas. Grandpa says you saved everyone, not just the people who lived, but all the people who live here from now on, because their houses won't blow away." Marcus took the drawing, his throat suddenly tight. "Thank you, I'll keep it forever." Emma smiled, then ran back the hill toward the nearest house where her friends were playing. Clay watched her go with an expression Marcus had learned to recognize over the past 9 months. Pride mixed with pain. Joy mixed with the permanent knowledge of how easily it could all be lost. "She's doing better," Clay said. "The nightmares are less frequent. Her therapist says she's processing the trauma in healthy ways." "That's good." Marcus kept his eyes on the valley. "What about you?" "Me." Clay pulled out his cigarettes, then put them back without lighting one. He'd been trying to quit. "I'm alive. My granddaughter is alive. That's more than 19 families can say. I don't get to complain about nightmares." "Survivor's guilt isn't something you can logic away," Marcus said quietly. "Believe me, I've tried." Clay nodded. They stood in silence for a while, 2 men who'd started as enemies and become something like brothers through shared catastrophe. Below them, children played between the round houses. Adults worked in gardens, preparing for fall harvest. Smoke rose from chimneys as people cooked dinner. It looked normal. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place where people could live and grow old and die of natural causes instead of wind. There's talk of making it official, Clay said. Changing the zoning laws to require circular construction for all new buildings in the county, making what you built here the standard instead of the exception. That's not necessary. People should be free to choose. Should they? Clay turned to look at him. Should people be free to choose death because they're too stubborn or too ignorant to know better? You and I both know that if this valley had been full of round houses last December, everyone would have survived, every single person. Those 19 families would be whole. Those children would have their parents. Freedom to choose is great until your choice kills people. Marcus thought about Afghanistan, about Lieutenant Drummond choosing to ignore warnings because he had the freedom to make that choice. About 7 men dead because one man's freedom to be wrong had consequences for everyone under his command. I don't know, he said finally. I don't have answers about freedom versus safety. All I know is that I built something that works, and I taught people who wanted to learn. What they do with that knowledge is up to them. Clay nodded. Fair enough. He turned to leave, then stopped. Marcus, there's one more thing. The families that sued you, the ones that dropped the case, they want to apologize. In person. Will you let them? Marcus looked down at Emma's drawing, at the valley that learned, at the permanent record of how disaster could transform into wisdom if people were brave enough to admit they'd been wrong. Yeah, he said, I'll let them. The apologies came in September, one by one, families showing up at his cabin with words that came hard and tears that came easy. Marcus listened to all of them. He accepted their regret and offered his own, because he'd failed too. Failed to find the right words to make them listen when it mattered. Everyone had failed together, and the only redemption was in what they built afterward. On December 12th, 1 year after the tornado, the valley held a memorial service. They gathered in the center of the round houses, standing in a circle that mirrored the architecture around them. 42 houses, 42 families, 19 names read aloud, remembered, mourned. Clay Brennan spoke, his voice breaking as he took responsibility for the deaths he'd helped cause by teaching people not to listen. Others spoke too, sharing memories of the lost, acknowledging mistakes, promising to do better. Marcus stood silent through most of it. Atlas pressed against his leg. He didn't have words for what he felt. Relief that it was over. Sorrow that it had happened. Fear that someday, somewhere, people would forget this lesson and others would die for that forgetting. He thought about the 7 soldiers buried in Afghanistan, about how their deaths had been called unavoidable, how no one had been blamed because blaming people meant admitting the system had failed. Here at least there was honesty. Here people admitted they'd been wrong. It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Emma found him after the service. She was wearing a black dress that was already too small for her growing frame, and she carried a single flower, a late-blooming aster that shouldn't have survived into December but had. This is for Atlas, she said, because he tried to warn everyone even when they wouldn't listen. Marcus took the flower and tucked it behind Atlas's ear. The dog looked ridiculous and dignified at the same time, a warrior wearing a memorial. Emma giggled despite the solemnity of the day, and the sound was like light breaking through clouds. That night, Marcus sat in his cabin with the drawing Emma had given him pinned to the wall. The valley that learned. He hoped it was true. He hoped the 42 families would remember, would teach their children, would pass down the story of the day when stubbornness and ignorance had cost 19 lives and the lesson that followed. He hoped other valleys would hear and learn without having to pay the same price. But hope wasn't certainty, and as Marcus lay down to sleep with Atlas curled beside him, he knew that somewhere, someday, another storm would come to a place that wasn't ready. Another person would try to warn and fail to be heard. Another collection of square houses would fall while one round structure stood. The cycle would continue because people were people, flawed and frightened and resistant to change until change was forced upon them by disaster. All he could do was keep teaching, keep building, keep bearing witness to what he'd learned in Afghanistan and confirmed in Montana. That corners were weakness, that circles were strength, that listening to a dog who dug at the earth might save your life if you were humble enough to admit that wisdom came in unexpected forms. Atlas stirred in his sleep, legs twitching as he dreamed of running across fields that only existed in memory. Marcus rested his hand on the dog's side, feeling the heartbeat under fur and muscle, steady and strong and alive. They'd both survived when survival seemed impossible. They'd both been proven right when everyone said they were wrong. And they'd both learned that being right was the loneliest place in the world until someone finally listened. Outside, the Montana wind whispered around the cabin's curved walls and slid past without finding purchase. The structure stood firm against the night, a monument to loss and learning, to the terrible price of ignorance and the hard-won value of humility. And in the morning, Marcus would wake and teach someone new how to build something that would stand. Because that was all anyone could do. Build, teach, hope that the next generation would be wiser than the last, and trust that somewhere, maybe, a dog was watching the horizon and someone was finally listening. Atlas started digging again on November 3rd, 1 year and 11 months after the first tornado. Marcus Hayes woke at dawn to find the German Shepherd at the northeast corner of the round cabin, his front paws tearing into earth that had already frozen with the first hard frost of winter. The dog's breath came in white puffs in the cold air. His movements were frantic, obsessive, exactly the way they'd been 23 months ago when no one believed and 19 people died. Marcus stood on the porch in his thermal underwear, watching the dog destroy his paws against ground that hadn't thawed since October. The barometer hanging beside the door read 1,007 millibars. Normal for a November morning in Montana, the sky was pale blue and clear. The weather forecast called for cold and sunny conditions through the end of the week. There was no reason for Atlas to be digging. No reason except the one that made Marcus's stomach clench with remembered dread. "Atlas," Marcus called. The dog ignored him. "Come here, buddy." Still nothing, just the scraping of claws on frozen dirt and the low growl building in the animal's chest. Marcus walked down from the perch and knelt beside the dog, placing both hands on Atlas's shoulders. The shepherd was 8 years old now, gray around the muzzle, his injured hind legs stiff with arthritis that the surgery had helped but not cured. He shouldn't have been able to dig like this, shouldn't have had the strength or the mobility. But fear was stronger than pain. Instinct overrode limitation. "Talk to me," Marcus whispered. "What are you sensing?" Atlas finally stopped digging. He turned his head toward the mountains to the east, ears forward, body rigid. Marcus followed his gaze and saw nothing unusual, just the Bitterroot Range rising against the morning sky, snow-covered peaks glowing pink in the early light, beautiful and peaceful, and offering no hint of danger. But Marcus had learned years ago that absence of visible threat didn't mean absence of actual threat. Sometimes disaster announced itself only to those who knew how to listen. And Atlas was listening to something Marcus couldn't hear. He checked the barometer again when they went back inside. Still normal. He pulled up weather data on his laptop. The National Weather Service showed a high-pressure system sitting over western Montana, stable and predicted to remain in place for 5 days. No storms, no atmospheric disturbances, no reason whatsoever to be concerned. Marcus closed the laptop and looked at Atlas, who had positioned himself by the door and refused to move, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. "This can't be happening again," Marcus said aloud. "Not again, not now." But the dog didn't care about Marcus's denial. Atlas knew what he knew, and what he knew was that danger was building somewhere beyond human perception, gathering itself like a fist preparing to strike. Marcus had ignored that knowledge once, 5 years ago in Afghanistan, and 7 men had died. He'd learned from it the second time, in this very valley, but barely in time and not well enough to save everyone. Now here it was again, the impossible choice. Trust the data or trust the dog. Believe the experts or believe the trauma-scarred veteran whose best friend was a service animal with PTSD of his own. Marcus made coffee and sat at his small table, watching Atlas watch the door. The past 23 months had been the most stable period of his life since before the Army. He'd become something like respected in Bitterroot Valley, no longer the crazy outsider, but the man who'd saved lives and rebuilt a community. He taught classes twice a week at the community center, showing people from all over Montana how to build circular structures that could withstand extreme weather. The University of Montana had offered him an adjunct teaching position. The governor had presented him with a civilian service medal. Atlas had been featured in a national magazine as America's most heroic dog, complete with a photo shoot that the animal had tolerated with confused dignity. They'd built a life here, a good life. And Marcus knew with absolute certainty that if he went down into the valley today and started warning people about another tornado based solely on his dog's behavior, everything he'd built would collapse. The credibility, the respect, the fragile acceptance. People would think he'd finally cracked completely, that the PTSD had won, that he was trying to relive his moment of vindication by manufacturing another crisis. They'd smile and nod and stop inviting him to things. They'd whisper behind his back. They'd pull their children away from the strange man who cried wolf. And yet Atlas was digging. And the barometer, when Marcus checked it a third time, had dropped 2 millibars in the past hour. Not much, barely significant, within normal variance, but dropping. By noon, the pressure had fallen to 1,003 millibars. By 3 in the afternoon, 998. Marcus called the Weather Service office in Missoula. A woman named Jennifer answered, her voice cheerful and professional. Hi, this is Marcus Hayes in Bitterroot Valley. I'm calling to report some unusual atmospheric conditions. What kind of conditions, Mr. Hayes? Dropping barometric pressure, temperature anomalies. I think there might be a storm system building that isn't showing up on your models. There was a pause. Mr. Hayes, hold on one moment, please. The line clicked to hold music. When Jennifer came back, her voice had changed. Less cheerful, more careful. Mr. Hayes, I'm showing you've called this number 14 times in the past 2 years, reporting various weather concerns. Is that correct? I call when I see something unusual. That's correct. And in all those 14 calls, how many times has your report resulted in an actual weather event? Marcus closed his eyes. Once. The December tornado 2 years ago. Right. The one event that we've already extensively studied and incorporated into our forecasting models. Mr. Hayes, I understand that experience was traumatic for you and for your community. But we can't issue weather warnings based on feelings or on pet behavior. We have sophisticated instruments and trained meteorologists. Right now, those instruments show absolutely no indication of severe weather in your area. I'm going to respectfully suggest that you might want to speak with your therapist about anxiety management. My dog has never been wrong, Marcus said quietly. Your dog is an animal, Mr. Hayes. Animals get anxious for lots of reasons. Maybe there's a predator nearby. Maybe he's not feeling well. Maybe he's picking up on your own stress. But we can't evacuate communities because a dog is digging holes. I'm sure you understand that. Marcus understood. He thanked Jennifer for her time and hung up. Atlas was at the door again, whining. The sound was high and desperate, the noise of an animal in psychological distress. Marcus had heard that sound only twice before. Once in Afghanistan, 6 hours before the Haboob. Once in Montana, 24 hours before the EF4. Both times people had died because Marcus hadn't made them listen. He drove down to the valley. 42 round houses stood where 46 square ones had been destroyed. The transformation was remarkable. What had once looked like a typical Montana settlement now resembled something from another time. A collection of circular dwellings that could have been traditional Mongolian gurs or ancient Celtic roundhouses. Different materials, different scale, but the same essential wisdom. Survival through curves, strength through geometry. Clay Brennan's house was the third one built, larger than most because he'd needed room for Emma and for the memories of family that haunted every corner. Marcus found him in the workshop behind the house, building furniture with the same obsessive focus he'd applied to everything since the tornado. The big rancher had aged 20 years in 2. His hair had gone completely gray. He'd developed a tremor in his left hand, but his eyes were still sharp, still capable of seeing past surface pleasantness to uncomfortable truth. It's happening again, isn't it? Clay said without looking up from the chair he was sanding. I don't know. Atlas thinks so. What's the weather service say? They say I'm anxious and my dog is reacting to my stress. Clay set down the sandpaper. What do you say? Marcus sat on a workbench, suddenly exhausted. I say my dog has saved more lives than every meteorologist in Montana combined. I say atmospheric science is good but not perfect. I say I watched barometric pressure drop 8 millibars today for no reason the models can explain. And I say I don't know if I can do this again. I don't know if I can go door to door and beg people to believe me. I barely survived the first time. You saved 23 people the first time, and 19 died. Marcus looked at his hands. If I warn people and I'm wrong, I lose everything. My credibility, my reputation, my place here. Everything I've built over 2 years disappears. People will say I'm unstable. Parents won't let Emma near me anymore. The university will rescind their teaching offer. I'll be the crazy veteran again, the one everyone tolerates but nobody trusts. And if you don't warn people and you're right, then they die, and I have to live with that again. Clay walked over and sat beside him on the workbench. The workshop smelled of sawdust and varnish, clean, honest smells of creation. Outside, the November wind moved through the valley, cold and constant, and giving no sign of building toward violence. You know what my therapist told me last week, Clay said? She told me that guilt is just love with nowhere to go. All those people who died in the tornado, I love them. Not romantic love, but community love. Neighbor love. The kind of love that makes you bring soup when someone's sick, or help fix a fence, or wave from across the road. And when they died, that love didn't die with them. It just stayed in me with nowhere to go, so it turned into guilt. This crushing weight of guilt that makes it hard to breathe sometimes. Marcus nodded. He understood that feeling. But here's the thing, Clay continued. Guilt is selfish. It's about me and my feelings and my pain. It's about how I have to live with what happened, whereas actually keeping people safe, actually warning them even when they might laugh at me, that's not about me at all. That's about them, about their kids and their futures and their right to make informed decisions about their own safety. So you think I should warn everyone? I think you should do what you already know you need to do. Clay stood and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. I think that dog of yours is smarter than both of us combined. And I think being wrong and embarrassed is a hell of a lot easier to live with than being right and silent. Marcus found Emma at the community center, where she was taking an after-school art class. She was 10 now, growing into herself, no longer the frightened child who'd clung to Atlas in the aftermath of disaster. She'd become the valley's unofficial historian, collecting stories from survivors, drawing pictures of the old square houses and the new round ones, creating a visual record of transformation. Her art teacher said she had remarkable talent. Marcus thought she just had remarkable memory. She couldn't forget what had happened, so she channeled it into something permanent. She saw Marcus through the window and waved. He waved back and she gathered her materials and came outside. Is something wrong? Her intuition was sharp. She could read adults better than most adults could read each other. Atlas is worried, Marcus said. He's digging again, like before. Emma's expression shifted instantly, fear flashing across her face before she controlled it. Is the storm coming back? I don't know, maybe. The weather people say no, but Atlas says yes. She was quiet for a moment, processing. Then she said, what if you're wrong this time? What if Atlas is wrong? Then I look stupid and people laugh at me. That's all. Grandpa says if you warn people and you're wrong, you might have to leave the valley. That people won't trust you anymore. Your grandpa talks too much. Emma smiled slightly, but it faded quickly. I don't want you to leave. You're the one who built the houses that keep us safe. You're the one who taught everyone. If you leave because you tried to save us again, that's not fair. Marcus knelt so he was eye level with her. Emma, listen to me. Nothing that happens is your responsibility. Not the storm, not my choices, not whether people believe me or not. You're 10 years old. Your only job is to be 10 years old. Okay? Okay. But her voice said she didn't believe it, that she already understood the adult truth that everyone carries responsibility for everything, whether they want to or not. Marcus stood. If anything happens, if the weather changes or if your grandfather tells you to, I want you to go to your basement immediately. Don't wait. Don't ask questions. Just go. Can you do that for me? I can do that. He left her there at the community center and drove slowly through the valley, looking at the houses he'd helped build, the families he'd helped save. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in yards. A normalcy that felt both precious and fragile, like glass that could shatter at any moment if the wrong frequency of sound hit it. The barometer read 992 millibars when he got home. Atlas was still at the door, shaking now, his whole body trembling with stress. Marcus sat on the floor beside him and pulled the dog close. I hear you, he whispered. I believe you, I'm just scared. Atlas turned and licked his face, one long swipe of rough tongue across Marcus's cheek. Then the dog went back to watching the door, waiting for disaster or vindication, probably unable to tell the difference. Marcus made his decision at sunset. He would warn people, not with flyers this time, not with door-to-door visits. He'd learned that personal confrontation just made people defensive. Instead, instead, he sent a text message to every phone number in his contacts, 47 people who'd given him their numbers over the past 2 years. The message was simple. Atlas is showing storm warning behavior. Barometric pressure dropping abnormally. Maybe nothing. Maybe another event like December 2023. Please consider having emergency plans ready. Basement stocked. Stay alert. I hope I'm wrong. Marcus. Then he posted the same message to the Bitterroot Valley Community Facebook page and turned off his phone. Whatever happened next was out of his control. He'd given warning. He'd fulfilled his obligation. Now he could only wait and see if anyone listened. The responses started within minutes. Marcus didn't see them, but Clay did, and he called Marcus's landline at 8 p.m. to tell him about it. You've got about 60 comments on that Facebook post, Clay said. Maybe half are supportive. The other half are saying you are fear-mongering. There's a whole thread about whether the community should ask you to stop making these kinds of announcements because they're causing unnecessary anxiety. Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter. That's about what I expected. Jennifer Chen from the Weather Service posted that there's no scientific basis for your warning and people should rely on official sources. 3 people shared that and added their own comments about not trusting PTSD veterans with public safety information. Also expected. But here's the thing, Clay said. 20 families have already stocked their basements. I'm getting calls from people asking what supplies they should have. Emma's school is talking about doing a storm drill tomorrow just in case. You scared people, Marcus. But scared is alive. Marcus looked at Atlas, who hadn't moved from his position at the door. Scared is alive, he repeated. Yeah, I guess it is. By morning, the barometric pressure had dropped to 984 millibars. The temperature had risen 12 degrees overnight, jumping from 28 to 40 in darkness. Impossible for November without a weather system driving the change. The sky had turned from blue to a pale yellow Marcus recognized from nightmares. He called the weather service again. Got a different person this time, a man named Robert, who listened to Marcus's report with professional patience and then explained that the temperature increase was a Chinook wind pattern, well understood and documented, nothing to be concerned about. The pressure drop was within normal variance. There were no storms in any model, no satellite indication of severe weather formation, no reason for alarm. What would it take, Marcus asked, for you to issue a warning? Concrete meteorological data showing immediate threat, Robert replied. Formation of a supercell, radar indication of rotation, visual confirmation of a funnel cloud, the things we train for and watch for every day. And if by the time you see those things, it's too late to warn anyone, then we document it and improve our models for next time. That's how science works, Mr. Hayes. We learn from events we miss. But we can't issue warnings based on speculation or on animal behavior. The false alarm rate would be unacceptable. Marcus hung up. False alarms, that's what they were worried about. Not missed disasters, but false alarms. Because apparently crying wolf was worse than letting sheep get eaten. The logic made sense from a systems perspective. Issue too many warnings that don't pan out and people stop listening to any warnings at all. But it left no room for the space between data and disaster. That liminal zone where Atlas lived, where instinct operated faster than instruments. Clay called at 10 a.m. The Valley's organizing a meeting at the community center. People want to hear from you directly. Will you come? Are they angry? Some are. Some are scared. Some just want information. But yeah, Marcus, you need to come. You can't drop a bomb like this and then hide. Marcus drove down with Atlas in the passenger seat. The dog hadn't eaten in 2 days. His eyes were sunken. He looked old and sick and desperate. Marcus wondered if this was what a breakdown looked like in animals. If dogs could have psychotic episodes triggered by old trauma. If maybe Jennifer Chen had been right, and Atlas was just reacting to Marcus's own anxiety in a feedback loop that had nothing to do with actual atmospheric conditions. But then they passed the thermometer at the gas station and it read 53 degrees. In November, in Montana. And Marcus knew that whatever was happening was real, even if the instruments couldn't see it yet. The community center was packed, 70 people crammed into a space meant for 40. Marcus walked to the front with Atlas limping beside him. The crowd went quiet. He could feel their attention, heavy and expectant. Some faces were friendly, others hostile. Most were just uncertain, ordinary people caught between competing authorities and trying to figure out who to believe. Emma was there with Clay, sitting in the front row. She waved at Atlas and the dog's tail wagged once, briefly, before he went back to his vigilant scanning of the room. Marcus took a breath and began. 23 months ago, most of you thought I was crazy. I built a strange house and made predictions that seemed impossible. 19 people died because they didn't believe those predictions. 23 people lived because they did. I don't want to convince anyone of anything today. I just want to present facts and let you make your own decisions. He went through it methodically. The barometric pressure data, the temperature anomaly, Atlas's behavior and his historical accuracy, the limitations of meteorological models, the fact that the December 23 tornado had also occurred under conditions the Weather Service said were impossible right up until the moment the tornado formed. Someone in the crowd raised a hand. Marcus nodded to him. The Weather Service says you're wrong. Are you saying they're lying? I'm saying they're constrained by their models. Models are great for predicting things that fit known patterns. They're terrible for predicting things that don't. The December tornado didn't fit any pattern. It shouldn't have happened. But it did, and if I'm reading the signs correctly, another one is building right now. What signs? A woman this time, her voice sharp with skepticism. Your dog is anxious. That's not a sign. That's an animal having a reaction to something we can't see. That's exactly what it is, Marcus agreed. A reaction to something we can't see. The question is whether that something is real or imaginary. 2 years ago, you would have said it was imaginary, then 46 houses got destroyed. I'm asking you to consider that maybe, possibly, a German shepherd with trauma from surviving combat in a tornado has developed a sensitivity to atmospheric conditions that our instruments haven't caught up to yet. Clay stood. I'm going to be in my basement from noon today until Marcus or the Weather Service tells me it's safe. Emma will be with me. Anyone who wants to join us is welcome. Anyone who doesn't, that's your choice. But make it an informed choice. Don't ignore this because you think Marcus is crazy. Look at the data. Look at the sky. Make your own decision. The meeting broke up without consensus. Some people came to Marcus afterward and shook his hand, thanked him for the warning, said they'd be ready. Others left without speaking, their body language broadcasting skepticism. A few were openly hostile, including a man named Derek, whose brother had died in the first tornado, and who seemed to have decided that Marcus was somehow responsible for creating disasters rather than predicting them. You're not a hero, Derek hissed as he passed. You're a trauma junkie who needs catastrophe to feel relevant. There's no storm coming. There's just you trying to relive your glory days. Marcus didn't respond. There was nothing to say to that kind of pain. Derek needed someone to blame, and Marcus was convenient. It didn't matter that Derek's logic made no sense. Grief rarely did. By 3 p.m., the temperature had hit 62 degrees. The sky had gone from yellow to a sick greenish copper. The wind had stopped completely, leaving the valley in unnatural stillness. And the barometric pressure had dropped to 976 millibars. Marcus's phone, which he'd finally turned back on, started ringing. First Clay, then the sheriff, then a reporter from the Missoulian, then Jennifer Chen from the Weather Service, her voice no longer cheerful but urgent. Mr. Hayes, we're seeing some unusual readings. We're not issuing a warning yet, but we want you to know we're monitoring the situation. How long until you issue a warning? Marcus asked. We need more data. Probably 2 to 3 hours if conditions continue to develop. 2 to 3 hours. Marcus looked at his watch. It was 3:47 p.m. If the pattern held from last time, the tornado would hit around 5 p.m. Maybe sooner. The Weather Service would issue their warning at 6 after it was over, when their instruments finally confirmed what Atlas had known for days. He called Clay. Get Emma underground now. Don't wait for an official warning. Already there, we've got 14 families with us. Basements are full. We're ready. Good. Marcus paused. Clay, if I'm wrong about this, if nothing happens, I'm leaving the valley. I can't put everyone through this again if I'm just a broken veteran seeing patterns that don't exist. And if you're right, then I guess I get to stay broken and alive instead of broken and guilty. Marcus spent the last hour before the storm sitting on his porch with Atlas. The dog had finally stopped digging. He'd stopped shaking. He just sat beside Marcus, pressed against his leg, and together they watched the sky turn colors that sky should never turn. Green bleeding into purple. Purple shot through with veins of yellow. The light was wrong. The air pressure was wrong. Everything was wrong in ways that had no name but which every instinct screamed about. At 4:53, the funnel formed. Marcus saw it descend from the cloud base 5 miles to the northeast, a finger of God reaching down to touch the earth. It was massive, wider than the first one, darker, more clearly defined. Beautiful and terrible in the way that overwhelming force is always beautiful if you're far enough away to not be destroyed by it. He pulled out his phone and called 911. There's a tornado on the ground northeast of Bitterroot Valley. You need to activate the emergency system now. Sir, we have no indication of a tornado in your area. Are you certain of what you're seeing? I'm watching it with my own eyes. It's an EF4 or higher. It's going to hit the valley in less than 10 minutes. Please, you have to warn people. Hold on. The dispatcher put him on hold. Marcus could hear sirens beginning to wail in the distance as someone finally believed him. The emergency broadcast system activated. Phone alerts started going out. All of it too late for anyone who'd ignored the warnings, who'd stayed in their homes because official sources said there was no danger. The tornado hit Bitterroot Valley at 5:08 p.m. Marcus and Atlas were in the round cabin, the vacuum-sealed door engaged, braced for impact. The sound was the same as before. The pressure changes were the same, but this time Marcus knew what to expect. This time he wasn't counting seconds in fear, but in assessment, analyzing how the structure performed, noting where stress concentrated, where the curved walls flexed, and where they held rigid. The cabin shuddered violently. The walls groaned under pressure that felt like it would crush them. Marcus wrapped his arms around Atlas, both of them pressed flat against the floor. The wind screamed like a living thing trying to tear the structure apart. Windows exploded inward despite the reinforced glass. The door rattled against its seal, straining but holding. And then Atlas did something Marcus would never forget. The dog, exhausted and terrified, somehow found the strength to stand. He pulled away from Marcus's grip and moved to the exact center of the cabin, where the pressure was greatest, where the circular floor met the curved walls, and he lay down. Not to hide, not to cower, but deliberately, pressing his 80-pound body flat against the wooden floor, adding his weight to the structure's foundation. Atlas, no! Marcus reached for him, but the dog growled, a sound that said, "Stay back." Atlas knew what he was doing. Every ounce of his body weight, small as it was, pressed down at the structural center point, creating additional downward force, shifting the center of gravity just enough to counterbalance the uplift from the wind. It was instinct operating at a level beyond Marcus's understanding. The dog had somehow sensed exactly where the weakness was and exactly how to shore it up. The pressure intensified. The walls bent inward, flexing dangerously close to their breaking point. But Atlas held his position, his body rigid, his eyes locked on Marcus with an expression that said, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." And incredibly, the cabin held. The joints didn't fail. The foundation didn't crack. The circle survived because Ye had understood geometry and physics at an intuitive level and had literally used his own body as ballast. 47 seconds. Then the pressure released. The wind shifted direction. The tornado moved past. Atlas remained in position for another full minute, making sure it was truly over before finally, slowly, standing up. His legs shook. He could barely walk, but his tail wagged once as he limped back to Marcus. Marcus gathered the dog into his arms, tears streaming down his face. "You just saved us again. You brilliant, impossible, perfect dog. You saved the house. You saved me. How did you know?" Atlas licked his face, too exhausted for anything more, and Marcus held him there on the floor of the cabin that had survived because a German shepherd understood things that engineers with degrees never would. When Marcus finally opened the door and looked out at the valley, he saw the miracle repeated 42 times. Every roundhouse standing, some had damage, windows blown out, roofs partially stripped, but all of them intact, all of them still structurally sound. Not a single one had collapsed. Marcus ran down the slope with Atlas struggling to keep up. They reached the first house, Beth's lighthouse, and Marcus pounded on the door. Beth opened it, white-faced but alive, and behind her 3 other families who'd taken shelter there. "We're okay," she said. "Oh God, Marcus, we're okay." He moved from house to house, everyone the same. Survivors emerging from basements, shocked and scared but alive. Families huddled together, children crying but breathing. The round houses had done exactly what Marcus designed them to do. They'd stood against impossible wind, and they'd protected everyone inside. 42 houses, 42 families, nearly 200 people safe. But as Marcus moved through the valley, he saw what the tornado had done to everything else. The FEMA trailers that had been set up at the edge of town, the temporary structures that were still there because some people hadn't yet rebuilt. Gone, completely erased. And in one of them, Derek, the man who'd called Marcus a trauma junkie. The man who'd refused to evacuate because he didn't believe the warnings. They found his body half a mile away, broken and lifeless. The only casualty of the second storm. One death that might have been prevented if Marcus had tried harder, warned louder, been more convincing. Clay found Marcus sitting on the ground near Derek's trailer site, Atlas beside him. The dog was licking Marcus's hand, trying to comfort him. Clay sat down on Marcus's other side. "You saved everyone else," Clay said quietly. 41 families, nearly 200 people, all alive because you warned them. "I didn't save Derek. Derek didn't want to be saved. He made his choice with full information. That's not on you." Marcus looked at the round houses standing in the ruins of everything else. A second tornado, a second chance. And this time almost everyone had listened, almost. "You know what this means," Clay said. "You and Atlas, you're 2 for 2. Every time that dog says danger is coming, danger comes. Nobody's going to doubt you anymore. Nobody's going to call you crazy. You've proven something that science can't explain but can't deny." Marcus stroked Atlas's head. The dog was exhausted, barely able to hold himself upright. "We didn't prove anything except that people need to build better and listen harder. The tornado would have come whether I warned anyone or not. All I did was give them a choice about how to face it." "That's everything," Clay said. "That's literally everything." Emergency crews arrived an hour later. The sheriff, FEMA, the weather service, including Jennifer Chen, who walked up to Marcus with tears in her eyes. "You were right," she said. "I don't understand how, but you were right. Our models showed nothing until the tornado was already on the ground. Whatever you and your dog are sensing, we need to figure it out. We need to learn from this." Marcus nodded, but he was too tired to care about vindication, too numb to feel triumph. Derek was dead. One man who'd been too broken by the first tragedy to survive being right the second time. It wasn't Marcus's fault. He knew that logically, but logic didn't ease the weight of one more ghost added to the collection he carried. As night fell, the survivors gathered in Clay's house, the largest of the round structures. 41 families crowded together, children sleeping on makeshift beds, adults talking in quiet voices about what came next. Emma found Marcus in a corner and sat beside him, Atlas between them. "Thank you for saving us again," she said. "Both times. Thank you for being right even when it was hard." Marcus looked at this 10-year-old who'd survived 2 tornadoes before she was old enough to understand mortality. "I'm sorry you had to learn these lessons so young. I'm sorry the world isn't safer than this." Emma leaned against Atlas, her hand buried in his fur. "Grandpa says the world is exactly as dangerous as it always was. We just notice it more after it tries to kill us. He says that's not a bad thing. Noticing danger means we can prepare for it. Better to be ready than surprised. Your grandpa is smarter than he looks." She smiled at that. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the murmur of voices around them, the sound of survival. Eventually, Emma fell asleep with her head on Atlas's side. The dog looked up at Marcus with eyes that were tired and old and satisfied. He'd done his job again. He'd warned his pack. He'd even saved the structure itself by pressing his body to the floor at exactly the right moment. It was enough. Marcus carried Emma to a cot in the corner and covered her with a blanket. Then he went outside with Atlas and stood looking at the valley under starlight. 2 tornadoes, 2 warnings, 2 chances to save lives, and 2 partial successes that felt like failures because perfect was impossible and almost was never quite good enough. But 41 families were alive, nearly 200 people breathing and whole. That had to count for something. That had to be enough to balance the scales against Derek and the 19 from before. Maybe not enough for complete redemption, but enough to keep trying, enough to keep building, enough to keep listening to a Bao who could sense storms that instruments missed and who trusted Marcus to translate that knowledge into action. The aurora borealis flickered overhead, green and purple curtains of light dancing across the northern sky. Rare for Montana, but not impossible. Just like tornadoes in December and November were rare, but not impossible. The world was full of improbable things that happened anyway, and the key to survival was staying humble enough to admit you didn't know everything and brave enough to act on the things you did know. Atlas leaned against Marcus's leg, and Marcus rested his hand on the dog's head, and together they stood watch over a valley that had learned to listen. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. For now, it was enough. The third warning came on a morning when Atlas could barely stand. November had turned to December, then January, then February. 4 months after the second tornado, the valley had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like peace. The round houses stood firm against winter storms that would have damaged lesser structures. Snow piled high on curved roofs and slid off harmlessly, unable to find purchase on surfaces designed to shed weight. The community had grown closer, bound by shared survival and the knowledge that they'd learned something fundamental about how to live in a dangerous world. But Atlas was dying. Marcus had known it since Christmas, when the dog stopped eating solid food. The veterinarian had done x-rays and found tumors in the abdomen, aggressive and inoperable. Cancer, probably caused by exposure to something during his years of military service. Chemical weapons or burn pits, or just the accumulated toxicity of war. The vet had offered treatment options, chemotherapy that might buy a few months, but Marcus had declined. Atlas had spent 8 years protecting others. He'd earned the right to die with dignity rather than spend his final weeks sick from medicine. So Marcus had brought him home and made him comfortable and watched him grow thinner day by day. The dog slept most of the time now, his breathing shallow and labored. He couldn't walk more than a few steps without exhausting himself. But his eyes were still alert when he was awake, still watchful, still tracking movements and sounds with the vigilance that had saved so many lives. On this particular morning in late February, Marcus woke to find Atlas standing at the door. Not sitting or lying down, but standing on legs that shook with effort, his whole body trembling. The dog was staring west, not east where the tornadoes had come from, west toward the Bitterroot Range. Atlas, Marcus got up from his bed and moved to the dog's side. "Buddy, you need to rest. You're too weak for this." But Atlas didn't rest. He turned his head to look at Marcus, and the expression in those brown eyes was urgent, desperate. The same look he'd had before the tornadoes, but different somehow. More afraid, more certain. He barked once, a weak sound that came from deep in his failing body, and then collapsed. His legs simply gave out and he went down hard on the wooden floor. Marcus knelt beside him, running his hands over the thin frame. Atlas was all bones now, his coat dull, his breathing ragged. But his eyes never left the window that faced west. Whatever he was sensing, it terrified him more than dying did. Marcus carried the dog back to his bed, a pile of blankets near the wood stove. Atlas tried to get up again, but couldn't. He whined, high and anxious, and Marcus felt his heart break. The dog was using the last of his strength to warn about something, burning through whatever life remained to fulfill the purpose that had defined him since puppyhood. Protect, alert, save. "Okay," Marcus whispered. "I hear you. I see you. Tell me what's wrong." He looked out the window toward the mountains. The Bitterroot Range rose against a pale blue sky, snow-covered and beautiful and offering no obvious threat. But Marcus had learned long ago that Atlas didn't respond to obvious things. The dog sensed disturbances in the natural order that humans missed. Pressure changes before tornadoes, ground vibrations before earthquakes, the subtle wrongness that preceded disaster. Marcus checked his instruments. Barometric pressure was normal. Temperature was appropriate for late February, no atmospheric anomalies. But that didn't mean nothing was wrong. It just meant nothing was wrong with the air. And Atlas was staring at the mountains, not the sky. He called Clay. "It's happening again." "What's happening? Storm?" "I don't know. Atlas is warning about something to the west. The mountains. But there's no weather event building. This is different." Clay was quiet for a moment. "Different how?" "I don't know yet. But I need you to trust me. Can you come up here? Bring anyone who knows about geology or seismology. I think Atlas is sensing something with the earth, not the air." Clay arrived within an hour, bringing with him a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, a geology professor from the University of Montana who'd been studying the valley's unique architectural transformation. She was in her 40s, practical and direct, with the kind of competence that came from decades of fieldwork. She listened to Marcus explain Atlas's behavior, watched the dog stare at the mountains with the last of his strength, and didn't dismiss it as the paranoia of a dying animal. "Show me your seismic data," she said. "I don't have any." Marcus gestured helplessly. "I monitor weather, not earthquakes." Sarah pulled out a laptop and connected to the USGS database. She pulled up seismic readings for western Montana over the past week. Marcus and Clay watched over her shoulder as she scrolled through data, her expression growing more concerned with each screen. "There," she said, pointing to a series of small spikes. "Microseismic activity in the Bitterroot Range. Nothing major, all under magnitude 3. But the pattern is wrong. These aren't tectonic. They're more like settling, like something large is moving very slowly." "What could cause that?" Clay asked. Sarah zoomed in on a topographic map. "See this? The western slope of the range above the valley. It's steep, heavily forested, and it's been accumulating snow all winter. We've had record snowfall this year. Add in the temperature fluctuations from those 2 tornadoes, the ground disturbance from the wind damage, and you've got conditions for a massive slope failure." "You mean a landslide?" Marcus said. "I mean a debris avalanche." Sarah's voice was grim. "Potentially 50 million cubic yards of rock, soil, trees, and snow. If that slope lets go, it'll bury this entire valley under 100 feet of debris. Nothing will survive. Not houses, not people, not anything." Marcus looked at Atlas, who was still staring west with dimming eyes. "How much time do we have?" Sarah studied the data. "Based on the frequency of these microseismic events, I'd say 24 to 72 hours. But that's a guess. It could happen in the next hour. It could hold for weeks. There's no way to know for certain." "We need to evacuate," Clay said. "Everyone, immediately." Marcus shook his head. "We can't evacuate based on a guess. Not after 2 tornado warnings that turned out to be real. If we cry wolf a 3rd time and nothing happens, this community will never trust any warning again. We need to be certain." "Your dog seems certain," Sarah said quietly. "And frankly, looking at this data, I'm certain too. That slope is going to fail. The only question is when." And Marcus looked at Atlas, at the dog who'd never been wrong about danger, who'd saved nearly 200 lives across 2 tornadoes, who was spending the last energy of his life trying to warn about one more threat. The dog's breathing was getting shallower. He might not survive another day, but he was still staring at those mountains, still trying to protect his pack with everything he had left. "We evacuate," Marcus said. "Tonight, everyone moves east, away from the range. We don't wait for proof. We don't wait for official warnings. We trust Atlas one more time." The emergency meeting happened at sunset in Clay's house. Word had spread fast through the valley's text network, and within 2 hours every family was represented. Sarah Chen presented her geological data. Marcus explained Atlas's behavior and his perfect track record. Clay added his weight as the valley's de facto leader, the man who'd been wrong once and never wanted to be wrong again. But this time resistance was minimal. The community had learned its lessons in blood and rubble. When Marcus Hayes said danger was coming, you listened. When his dog sensed disaster, you prepared. 2 tornadoes had taught them that dismissing warnings cost lives while heeding them, even uncomfortable ones, meant survival. "How long do we have?" someone asked. Sarah answered, "Based on current seismic activity, probably 48 hours. But that's an estimate. It could be sooner." "Where do we go?" Marcus had already thought about this. "East, toward Missoula, at least 20 miles from the base of the range. Hotels, relatives' houses, anywhere out of the debris path. This isn't like the tornadoes where you can shelter in place. If that mountainside comes down, the round houses won't save you. Nothing will. You have to not be here." "And if nothing happens?" This was Derek's brother, still bitter about the death, still looking for reasons to distrust. "If we abandon our homes and this turns out to be another false alarm, then we come back embarrassed, but alive," Clay said. "And we thank God that we were wrong. But I'm not willing to bet my granddaughter's life on that slope holding. Not when every warning Marcus has given us has been right." The vote was unanimous. 42 families would evacuate within 24 hours. They'd take essential belongings, lock their round houses, and move east. The valley would be empty, left to whatever the mountains decided to do with it. That night, Marcus sat with Atlas as the dog's breathing became more labored. Emma came to say goodbye, kneeling beside the dying animal with tears running down her face. "Thank you for saving us 3 times, she whispered, her small hands stroking his head. "Thank you for being the bravest, smartest, most wonderful dog in the whole world. Atlas's tail moved slightly, one small wag, and then he closed his eyes. Emma left sobbing, and Marcus stayed beside the dog as the hours passed. He told Atlas stories about Afghanistan, about the men they'd saved together, about Carter who died despite everything. He told him about the first tornado, about the 19 who didn't listen, and the 23 who did. He told him about the second tornado, about Derek's choice, and the 41 families who survived, about nearly 200 people breathing because a bond had understood what humans couldn't. He told Atlas that he'd been a better soldier, a better friend, and a better judge of danger than any human Marcus had ever known. As dawn broke on February 28th, Atlas opened his eyes one final time. He looked at Marcus with perfect clarity, perfect recognition, and perfect peace. Then he exhaled slowly and didn't inhale again. Marcus sat holding the dog's body for an hour, feeling the warmth slowly leave, understanding that he'd just lost the one thing in his life that had never failed him. Atlas had been right about every danger: the haboob in Afghanistan, the first tornado in Montana, the second tornado, and now this, one last warning delivered with the final breath of a dying body. The evacuation began at noon. 42 families packed their vehicles with belongings and memories, locked their circular homes, and drove east toward Missoula. Marcus buried Atlas on the hill above his cabin, in a spot where the moss had liked to sit and watch over the valley. He marked the grave with a cairn of stones and a wooden cross carved with simple words: Atlas, Guardian, 2017 to 2026, never wrong. Then Marcus packed his own truck and prepared to leave. He was the last one out, wanted to make sure everyone else was safe before abandoning the valley himself. He did one final check of the houses, making sure doors were locked and windows secured, and then he stood at the entrance to Clay's home and looked back at what they built. 42 circles standing against the winter landscape, beautiful and strange, and representing everything he'd learned about survival and stubbornness and the price of being right. If the mountains came down, these houses would be buried under rock and soil, crushed despite their perfect engineering, destroyed not by wind, but by mass. All that work, all that teaching, all that transformation, gone under geology's indifferent weight. But the people would live. That's what mattered. The knowledge would survive in the minds of the 42 families who'd learned to build differently. The story would persist, and maybe, somewhere else, someone would hear about the valley that listened, and they'd choose curves over corners, wisdom over tradition, survival over aesthetics. Marcus drove east as the sun set. He found the evacuation group at a hotel complex in Missoula, where Clay had arranged rooms for everyone using emergency funds from the county. Emma ran to him when he arrived, threw her arms around his waist, and didn't let go for a long time. "I'm sorry about Atlas," she said. "I know you loved him. He loved you too." Marcus stroked her hair. "He loved all of us. That's why he spent his last days warning us one more time. Will the landslide really happen? I don't know. But if it does, we'll be safe here. That's what matters." They waited. One day became two. Two became three. Seismic monitors showed continued microseismic activity in the range, the mountain slowly settling, building toward release. Sarah Chen checked the data every hour, watching the pattern intensify. On March 2nd, 4 days after the evacuation, the frequency of tremors doubled. On March 3rd, it doubled again. "It's coming," Sarah said. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but soon." The landslide happened at 3:27 a.m. on March 4th. Marcus was awake, unable to sleep, watching weather radar on his phone, even though weather wasn't the threat. The hotel room shook slightly, just a tremor, barely noticeable. But he felt it, and he knew. He called Sarah. She was already awake, watching seismic data. "It's happening," she said. "Magnitude 5.2. That's the slope failing. The debris wave will hit the valley in less than 5 minutes." Marcus drove back, despite knowing he wouldn't arrive in time. He had to see it, had to witness what Atlas had given his life to warn about. He arrived at the eastern ridge overlooking Bitterroot Valley just as the sun rose, and what he saw made him understand how small human efforts were compared to the forces that shaped the world. The western slope of the Bitterroot Range had collapsed. 50 million cubic yards of earth moving at 60 miles per hour, a wave of destruction 100 feet high. It hit the valley like a tsunami of rock and soil and shattered trees. Marcus watched it bury everything. The round houses disappeared under the debris in seconds. Structures that had survived 2 tornadoes were crushed under weight they were never designed to withstand. The debris wave spread across the valley floor, filling it like a cup, and when it finally stopped moving, Bitterroot Valley was gone. Not damaged, not destroyed, gone. Erased under a new landscape of tumbled rock and broken earth that looked like it had always been there. Like the valley with its circular houses had been a dream that geology decided to wake from. Marcus stood on the ridge until Clay and Emma found him. The three of them watched the sun rise over a valley that no longer existed, over ground that had risen 100 feet in elevation and would never again be suitable for human habitation. The round houses were down there somewhere, buried but probably intact, crushed but not compromised. Perfect engineering preserved under perfect catastrophe. Atlas knew, Emma said quietly. Even when he was dying, he knew. He always knew, Marcus replied. That's what made him remarkable. Not that he could sense danger, but that he never stopped trying to warn us about it. Even at the very end, he chose protecting others over his own comfort. Clay put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. You both did. You could have kept quiet. You could have said you'd warned people twice and that was enough. But you didn't. You trusted him one more time. And 42 families, nearly 200 people, are alive because of that trust. They returned to the hotel as the news crews arrived. The landslide was big enough to make national headlines. Largest slope failure in Montana history. 50 million cubic yards of debris. A valley completely buried. And miraculously, 0 casualties because an entire community had evacuated based on warnings from a dying dog and the veteran who listened to him. The interview started immediately. Marcus refused most of them. He didn't want to talk about Atlas or heroism or vindication. He just wanted to grieve. But Sarah Chen convinced him to do one interview with a national science program to talk about the importance of multiple warning systems, about how animals could detect geologic precursors that instruments missed, about how indigenous peoples had known this for millennia and modern science was only beginning to catch up. The interviewer asked the obvious question, how did you know to trust your dog over the data? Marcus thought about that, because he'd never been wrong, because I'd seen what happened when people ignored him, because at some point, you have to decide whether you trust systems or relationships, whether you believe in instruments or instincts, whether you're willing to look stupid or willing to be dead. And I chose looking stupid 3 times. And 3 times it turned out I wasn't stupid at all, just early. The story spread. Not just the landslide, but the whole arc. Afghanistan and the Haboob, the first Montana tornado, and the 19 dead. The second tornado and the roundhouse is standing. The final warning delivered by a dying dog who cared more about his pack than his own survival. It became the kind of story that people shared and remembered, that got told around dinner tables and in classrooms, that entered the cultural mythology of what loyalty looked like when tested by the ultimate stakes. Atlas became famous posthumously. Photos of him circulated online, the German shepherd with the graying muzzle and the intense eyes. Statues were commissioned. Schools used his story to teach about animal cognition and disaster preparedness. The Army awarded him a posthumous commendation for his service, both during his active duty and after. The governor of Montana declared March 4th as Atlas Memorial Day, a reminder that safety sometimes came from unexpected sources and that wisdom meant being humble enough to listen to any warning, no matter how strange its origin. Marcus returned to the ridge above Bitterroot Valley 3 weeks later. The debris field had stabilized. Geologists were studying it, taking samples, trying to understand the mechanics of such massive slope failures. They'd confirmed what Sarah had predicted. Every building in the valley was buried under 80 to 120 feet of debris. The round houses were down there, probably intact under the weight, monuments to engineering excellence that no one would ever see again. He hiked up to where his cabin had been. It took him 4 hours to find the right spot because the landscape was unrecognizable, all the reference points gone. But eventually he found the hill, or what was left of it. The debris had overtopped it, filled in the low ground, created a new elevation profile. His cabin was somewhere beneath his feet, buried with everything else. But Atlas's grave was still there. The cairn had been scattered by the debris wave, but the wooden cross remained, driven deep into the ground and somehow untouched. Marcus rebuilt the cairn, adding more stones, making it larger, ensuring it would be visible from a distance. Emma and Clay found him there as the sun was setting. They'd followed him, giving him space to grieve but not leaving him alone. Emma carried flowers, the first spring blooms, and she placed them on the rebuilt cairn. "Is this where we'll build the memorial?" she asked. Marcus looked at her. "What memorial?" "The one for Atlas and for everyone who learned to listen. Grandpa says we're going to build it here, where your cabin was. A place where people can come and remember what happened. All 3 times. The haboob, the tornadoes, the landslide, all the warnings that were ignored, and all the warnings that saved lives." Marcus looked at Clay. "You're serious?" "The state's allocating funds. So is the university. So is FEMA. Everyone wants to be part of this. The Atlas Institute for Disaster Awareness. A teaching center where we train people to recognize multiple warning signs, to respect animal behavior, to build better structures. We want you to run it." Marcus sat on a rock near the grave. "I'm not a teacher. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a veteran who listened to his dog." "That's exactly why you're qualified," Clay said. "Because you understand that knowledge comes from relationships, not just textbooks. Because you've been proven right enough times that people will listen when you speak. Because you lost everything twice and rebuilt it both times, and you understand what survival costs." Emma sat beside Marcus. "The memorial should have a wall with all the names. The 19 from the first tornado, Derek from the second, and then everyone who survived because they listened. Nearly 200 people who are alive because of you and Atlas. That's what people need to see. Not just the losses, but the saves." Marcus looked out over the buried valley as stars began to appear. Somewhere under that debris field were 42 round houses, preserved like artifacts, waiting for future archaeologists to discover them and wonder what kind of people had built circular homes in Montana and why. The answer would be in the story, in the oral history that survivors would pass down. They built round because they learned from disaster. They built round because a man and a dog taught them that tradition could be deadly and innovation could save. The Atlas Institute broke ground in June on the ridge above the buried valley. It was built as a series of circular structures, of course, radiating out from a central hub like a flower. The largest building housed classrooms and laboratories where people studied geology, meteorology, animal behavior, and architectural engineering. Smaller buildings held dormitories for students and researchers. At the center, visible from everywhere in the complex, stood a statue. Atlas and Marcus, life-size in bronze, the man kneeling beside the dog, both of them looking west toward the mountains. The dedication ceremony happened on December 12th, 3 years after the first tornado. Hundreds of people attended, the 42 families who'd survived all 3 disasters. Scientists and engineers from around the world. Military personnel honoring one of their own, journalists covering the story, and children, lots of children, because Emma had insisted that kids needed to see this, needed to understand that survival came from learning and adapting and being willing to look stupid if stupid meant safe. Marcus spoke briefly. He talked about Lieutenant Drummond and the 7 soldiers who died because authority refused to listen to warnings. He talked about the 19 people in Bitterroot Valley who died the same way. He talked about Derek, who couldn't move past the first loss to save himself from the second. And he talked about the nearly 200 who lived because they chose humility over pride, because they admitted that a dog might know things they didn't, because they built differently and evacuated when warned and put survival above comfort. But mostly he talked about Atlas, about loyalty and duty, and the kind of love that transcended species, about a working dog who'd been injured saving lives and kept saving them anyway until his body quit, about an animal that modern science would classify as property, but which demonstrated more wisdom and courage than most humans Marcus had ever known. At the end of his speech, Marcus walked to the statue and placed his hand on the bronze Atlas's head. Emma joined him, her hand beside his. Then Clay. Then one by one, every person who'd been saved by the dog's warnings came forward and touched the statue, a pilgrimage of gratitude, until nearly 200 handprints covered the bronze surface. That night, after everyone left, Marcus climbed back up to the gravesite. The cairn had been incorporated into the memorial, enlarged and formalized, surrounded by a circular wall where names were engraved. Nearly 200 names of survivors, 20 names of those who didn't make it. And above them all, carved in letters large enough to read from 100 feet away, a single word. Listen. Marcus sat beside the cairn as stars wheeled overhead. The same stars that had watched over Afghanistan when the Haboob came. The same stars that had seen Bitterroot Valley destroyed twice and buried once. The same stars that would be there long after human structures crumbled and human stories were forgotten. But for now, in this moment, the story survived. The lesson persisted. And somewhere, maybe, another person was learning to trust warnings that came from unexpected sources. Another community was choosing to build differently. Another dog was alerting to danger, and another human was choosing to listen. Marcus thought about the arc of his life, from Afghanistan to Montana, from broken veteran to reluctant teacher, from man who failed to save his unit to man who saved nearly 200 civilians. It wasn't redemption exactly. The 7 soldiers were still dead. The 19 victims of the first tornado still haunted him. Derek's choice still hurt, but it was something, balance maybe, or at least the beginning of peace. He pulled out a worn photograph from his wallet. Atlas at 2 years old in Afghanistan, alert and strong and perfect. Before injury, before trauma, before the long road that led here. Marcus placed the photo on the cairn, weighted down with a stone. You did good, buddy. You did so good. Everything I have, everything I built, everything I know about survival, I learned from watching you. You were my teacher before you were my protector, and you never stopped teaching me, not even at the very end. The wind moved across the ridge, cold and clean, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. Marcus stood and looked out at the institute, at the circular buildings glowing with warm light against the darkness. Students were there right now, learning about wind dynamics and seismic precursors and how to read animal behavior. Tomorrow they'd study the history of Bitterroot Valley, the 3 disasters and the lessons each had taught. They'd learn Marcus's name and Atlas's story, and hopefully, some of them would carry that knowledge forward, would build better, would listen harder, would choose wisdom over tradition when tradition meant death. Marcus walked back down to the institute, to a small apartment in one of the dormitories. He slept that night without nightmares for the first time in 8 years. No visions of Carter's hand reaching from the sand. No sounds of 19 people dying in the tornado. No guilt about Derek choosing pride over survival. Just quiet. Deep, peaceful quiet. When he woke at dawn, Emma was waiting outside his door. She was 13 now, tall and serious, already talking about studying architecture in college, about dedicating her life to disaster-resistant design. She held a drawing, one of her detailed sketches that captured reality with almost photographic precision. I made this for you, she said, handing him the paper. The drawing showed the buried valley from above, as if viewed from a satellite. But it wasn't empty. Emma had sketched in the outlines of the 42 round houses, visible through the earth like ghosts, perfect circles preserved under imperfect catastrophe. And standing at the center where Marcus's cabin had been, she'd drawn Atlas. Not the old dying dog, but Atlas young and strong, standing guard over the buried structures, eternal watchman over the community he'd saved. At the bottom, in her careful handwriting, Emma had written words that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Some heroes bark, some heroes build, but the greatest heroes teach us to listen before the storm comes, to change before we're forced to, and to trust that safety sometimes comes from the sources we least expect. Thank you, Marcus and Atlas, for being heroes of all 3 kinds. Marcus hung the drawing on his wall, where morning light would hit it first thing every day. Then he and Emma walked to the main building of the institute, where his first class was scheduled to begin in an hour. Students from 12 countries, here to learn what one man and one dog had figured out through trauma and trust. Here to carry the lesson forward into a world that would always need reminding, that pride came before the fall, but humility came before survival. The sun rose over the Bitterroot Range, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose. The mountains stood unchanged, indifferent to human struggles, capable of building valleys and burying them with equal ease. But on the ridge below them, lights burned in circular buildings where people worked to make survival less about luck and more about choice. Where the story of Atlas lived on in every warning heeded, every structure designed to bend instead of break, every decision to trust the uncomfortable truth over comfortable denial. And on a cairn above it all, flowers left by Emma moved gently in the wind, bright color against gray stone. A reminder that memory didn't die when bodies did, that love persisted past loss, that a dog who spent his life protecting others had earned a kind of immortality that monuments could never fully capture, but hearts would never forget. The valley that learned, the dog that knew. The man who finally, after everything, understood that being right wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about caring enough to warn them anyway, again and again, until someone finally listened. And in that listening, in that choice to trust the strange and the uncomfortable and the apparently impossible, lay the only redemption that mattered. Not the redemption of reputation or recognition, but the redemption of lives continued, of children growing up, of communities rebuilt on the foundation of hard-won wisdom. Marcus Hayes had built many things in his life: bridges in Afghanistan, a cabin in Montana, roundhouses for 42 families, an institute for disaster awareness. But the thing he was most proud of, the thing he hoped would outlast all the physical structures, was this: he'd learned to listen. And in listening, he'd taught others to listen. And in that teaching lay the faint hope that maybe, somewhere, the next disaster would find a prepared community instead of a surprise one. That the next warning would be heeded before it was too late. That the next Atlas, in whatever form he came, would bark to people ready to hear. That would be enough. That would be everything. That would be the legacy worth leaving behind when his own time came. Not perfection, but improvement. Not immunity to disaster, but preparation for it. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to act despite it. The sun climbed higher, the day began, and Marcus Hayes walked into a classroom full of students ready to learn the lesson that had cost him everything and given him everything in return. That survival wasn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most prepared. It was about being humble enough to listen when the warning came, brave enough to act on what you heard, and wise enough to teach others so they wouldn't have to learn the same lessons through the same losses. And somewhere in the earth beneath the debris field, 42 round houses stood intact, monuments to the truth that Atlas had known all along, that corners fail and circles hold, that wind can be survived, that even the mountains themselves can be escaped if someone is paying attention, if someone cares enough to warn, if someone finally chooses to listen before the silence falls and the chance is gone forever.